She was still breathing when he found her. Barely. Officer Ava Mercer lay twisted across a frozen park bench, her police radio crackling static into empty air, white foam collecting at the corner of her mouth. The snow had already started covering her boots. Another 10 minutes, and nobody would have known she was there at all. The man who found her wasn't a doctor, wasn't a detective. He was just a guy walking his dog through a storm, trying to outrun his own nightmares. But some instincts don't retire when the uniform comes off. And the dog? The dog already knew something was wrong before either of them could see it. If you've never subscribed to this channel before, right now is the moment. Hit that button, turn on notifications, and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Because what happened in Black Ridge Crossing that winter? It doesn't stay buried, not tonight. The storm came without announcement. That was the thing about Black Ridge Crossing. The mountains swallowed weather systems whole and held them for days before releasing them down into the valley with no warning and no mercy. By 9 o'clock that Thursday evening in February, the temperature had dropped 11 degrees in under 2 hours. The roads had turned to glass, the kind of ice that doesn't look like ice until you're already sliding. Officer Ava Mercer had been on patrol since 4 in the afternoon. 5 hours of circuits through the same frozen streets, checking the same dark storefronts, running plates on the same 3 vehicles that always seemed to be parked in the same strange places. Black Ridge Crossing had a population of just over 4,000 people, and on a night like this, it felt closer to zero. Porch lights glowed behind curtains of snow. The occasional dog barked from inside some warm house. The town had the particular silence of a place that had learned to go indoors and wait things out. Ava didn't mind the silence. She'd grown up here. She understood it. What she didn't understand was why she felt wrong. It had started around hour 3, a faint unsteadiness, like the ground had shifted a quarter inch in a direction she couldn't name. She'd chalked it up to the cold, to the fact that she'd eaten a gas station protein bar at 2 in the afternoon and nothing since, to the headache that had been sitting behind her left eye since Tuesday and refused to leave. She pulled her cruiser to the curb on Halcyon Street and stepped out to check the lock on the public library's side entrance. Standard procedure, something she'd done 200 times. The cold hit her face like a slap. She took 2 steps forward, and then the world tilted. Not a metaphor. Not dizziness in the way you feel dizzy after standing up too fast. This was a full structural failure of something inside her nervous system, like the signals between her brain and her legs had been intercepted. Her hand shot out and caught the edge of a parking meter. She stood there, gripping cold metal, breathing through her nose, waiting for it to pass. "You're fine. You're fine. Eat something when you get back to the station." The feeling passed. Mostly. She got back in the cruiser. She drove 2 more blocks. She made a left onto Birch Avenue because that was the route, and she was going to finish the route because she had never not finished a route in 4 years on the Black Ridge Crossing PD, and she wasn't about to start now. The park came up on her right. Garrison Park was nothing special. 8 acres of walking paths, a small frozen pond, 3 old-fashioned lampposts that gave off just enough amber light to make the snow look like something from a postcard. In the summer, people brought their kids there. In February, at 9:15 at night, it was empty. She pulled over without meaning to. She didn't consciously decide to stop the car. Her hands just did it. Later, she would not be able to explain why. Some part of her had already understood what was coming and had moved her toward something solid before the rest of her caught up. She opened the door. She sat down on the park bench closest to the curb. She thought, "I'll just sit for 1 minute, just 1 minute." Her radio crackled, dispatch checking a code for a fender bender 3 miles south. She reached for the radio. Her arm wasn't cooperating. That was when the real fear arrived. Not the ordinary fear of something going wrong, but the cold, specific fear of your own body becoming unfamiliar. Her fingers found the radio but couldn't close around it. Her heartbeat, which had been slightly elevated for the past hour, in that background way you don't notice until you do, now lurched into something else entirely. Too fast. Arrhythmic. Wrong. Something is wrong with me. She managed to key the radio. What came out of her mouth she would not remember later. It wasn't coherent. It wasn't a proper distress call. The dispatcher on duty, a 22-year-old named Brendan who had been working nights for 8 months, heard a sound he would describe to investigators as like someone talking through water, and then static. Ava slumped sideways against the bench armrest. The snow kept falling. Ryan Mercer had been awake since 3 in the morning. This was not unusual. Sleep, for him, had become a negotiation since he'd come home. Something he could sometimes convince his body to do for 4 or 5 hours if he was exhausted enough, if he'd run enough miles or done enough physical labor to make his nervous system too tired to replay the things it wanted to replay. On nights when that didn't work, he walked. He'd rented a cabin 2 miles outside of town 6 weeks ago. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself a lot of things. He hadn't told the rental agency that he'd specifically chosen it because it sat at the end of a half-mile gravel road with no neighbors within shouting distance, or that the primary reason he wanted to be in Black Ridge Crossing at all was that he'd grown up here, and that coming home felt like the only direction he had left after everything else had run out. He wasn't sure if that made him brave or if it made him a coward. He hadn't decided yet. Coda walked beside him off-leash. The German Shepherd was 4 years old, all dark saddle and gold chest, built like something that should be wearing a rank insignia. Ryan had acquired him 18 months ago through a program that matched veterans with retired military working dogs, and the arrangement had turned out to be one of the few things in his post-service life that made uncomplicated sense. Coda didn't ask him how he was doing. Coda didn't look at him with that particular expression people used, the one that was trying to be warm but was actually just afraid of saying the wrong thing. Coda just walked beside him and occasionally glanced up as if checking that Ryan was still there. Ryan wore a dark green canvas jacket over 2 thermal layers, watch cap pulled low, boots that had seen actual combat and still had the scratches to prove it. He walked with his hands out of his pockets and his weight slightly forward, a habit so deeply embedded at this point that he genuinely couldn't remember learning it. Eyes up, scanning, the kind of alertness that doesn't turn off even when there's nothing to be alert for. He was crossing the edge of Garrison Park when Coda stopped. Not the kind of stop that meant the dog had found a scent worth investigating. Squirrel, rabbit, leftover sandwich dropped by a kid last Tuesday. This was different. Ryan felt it through the leash before he even processed what he was seeing, that tension in the line that meant Coda had shifted into a different mode entirely. The dog was staring at the bench near the park's entrance. Ryan looked. He saw the shape. Dark clothing against white snow. A figure that was too still, slumped at an angle that wasn't the angle of someone sitting. He moved. Not jogging. Running. Coda beside him and slightly ahead, already at the bench by the time Ryan covered the 30 yards. "Hey!" His voice came out level out of sheer habit. "Hey, talk to me." He registered several things in rapid succession, the way he'd been trained to triage a scene before letting himself react emotionally to any one piece of it. Female. Uniformed officer, mid to late 20s. Breathing. Yes, still breathing, shallow and irregular, but there. Lips, wrong color. Foam at the corner of her mouth, thin and white. Pupils when he pulled her eyelid up, blown wide despite the ambient light, non-reactive. Not hypothermia. He'd seen hypothermia. He'd carried 2 people out of a mountain in Afghanistan after a storm that had nearly killed his whole unit. This wasn't that. The smell hit him next. Something chemical underneath the cold air. Faint, almost not there, but his brain latched onto it and filed it somewhere urgent. Not the sharp ozone of electrical equipment, not fuel, something else, something synthetic. "Dispatch, this is..." He had her radio in his hand before he'd made the conscious decision to take it. "This is a civilian at Garrison Park, Birch Avenue entrance. I have an officer down. She's breathing, but she's unconscious, and I think she's been poisoned. I need EMS right now. Right now." The dispatcher, young, audibly startled, said something about confirming the location. "I just gave you the location," Ryan said. Not loud, not aggressive. The kind of flat precision that gets things done faster than yelling. "Birch Avenue entrance, Garrison Park. She's in uniform. Get EMS moving while you're confirming." He pocketed his own phone after dialing 911 as backup, then turned back to Ava. She was conscious enough to make a sound. Not words, just a sound. Small and involuntary, like pain filtering through sedation. "I've got you," Ryan said. He positioned himself behind her, got one hand under her shoulder to keep her from slipping further off the bench, checked her airway with the other. "Just breathe. Help is coming. Stay with me." Her eyes opened, barely, found his face. She said something he couldn't hear. He leaned in. Didn't fall. Her voice was almost nothing. Didn't fall, I didn't. I know, he said. He didn't know, not yet, but he said it. I know. Coda stood a foot away, ears forward, facing the tree line to the north, not moving, watching something in the darkness that Ryan could not see. The ambulance took 11 minutes. Ryan knew because he counted. Not in the obsessive way, but in the automatic way. The way you track time when time is the variable that determines outcomes. Every 90 seconds he checked Ava's breathing. Every 3 minutes he rechecked her pulse at the neck because the one at her wrist was too faint to be reliable. He talked to her when she seemed to surface toward consciousness, kept his voice steady and matter-of-fact. The same tone he'd used a dozen times in conditions where panic was a luxury nobody could afford. Stay awake for me. What's your name? A pause. Then, Mercer. Officer Mercer. Good. I'm Ryan. I'm going to stay right here. You're going to be fine. He didn't know if that was true, but silence felt worse. The EMTs arrived with a burst of red and white light that sliced through the snow like a bad dream. Ryan stepped back, gave them room, answered their questions with the specific, sequenced information they needed. Time of discovery. Observed symptoms. Estimated duration of unconsciousness. The chemical smell he couldn't identify. The lead EMT, a heavy-set man named Garcia with frost on his mustache, and the efficient movements of someone who'd been doing this for 20 years, looked at Ryan sharply when he got to the part about the smell. You sure about the smell? I'm sure I smelled something. I can't tell you what it was. Garcia exchanged a look with his partner that Ryan didn't miss. We'll take it from here. You can give your statement to... I know the process, Ryan said. I'm not going anywhere. Garcia looked at him again. Took in the jacket, the boots, the posture, whatever it is that makes people recognize something in other people. You military? Was. Garcia nodded once, like that settled a question he'd been asking silently. Follow us to County General. Detective on scene will want your statement. Ryan looked at Coda. The dog was still facing north, still watching the tree line. Ryan followed the direction of his stare into the darkness for a long moment. Nothing moved. No footprints that he could see in the fresh snow. But then again, the snow was falling hard enough to cover tracks in less than 10 minutes. He turned back to the ambulance. Come on, he said quietly. Coda looked at him, then back at the trees, then followed. County General Hospital served the whole mountain valley, which meant it served a population of about 18,000 people across 3 towns and several unincorporated patches of land. It was not a large hospital. It had 22 beds, 1 trauma bay, and a rotating roster of ER physicians who either loved the quiet or had run out of options elsewhere. The attending that night was a woman named Dr. Priya Nanda, who had come from a teaching hospital in Chicago 4 years ago and had, by all accounts, never explained why. She was thorough, fast, and had exactly zero interest in conversation that didn't directly relate to patient care. Ryan sat in the waiting area on a plastic chair that had been designed by someone who had never sat in a plastic chair. Coda lay at his feet, chin on the floor, watching the doors. The dog had been given a skeptical look by the front desk receptionist and a waiver to fill out by the security guard, but nobody had actually told them to leave, and Ryan had learned that if you didn't ask permission and didn't make yourself a problem, you could get away with a surprising amount. He had his hands folded on his knees and his eyes on the trauma bay doors. He'd had 3 cups of coffee from the machine down the hall, and none of them had tasted like coffee. The detective arrived at 10:15. Miles Donovan was 51 years old, thick through the shoulders in a way that suggested he'd once been in significantly better shape and had made his peace with the distance. He had dark circles under his eyes and a gray-streaked mustache, and the particular expression of a man who had been called in on his night off and was deciding whether to be angry about it. He introduced himself, sat down across from Ryan, opened a notepad that looked like it had been used for approximately 10,000 cases, and looked at Ryan the way detectives look at people they haven't categorized yet. You found her? Yes. You were walking your dog? Yes. In a blizzard, at 9:15 at night. Ryan met his eyes. I have trouble sleeping. The dog doesn't care about the weather. We walk. Donovan wrote something. What made you approach the bench? Coda stopped. He was looking at something. I looked, and I saw her. The dog. Yes. Donovan studied him. What branch? Navy. Special Operations. A beat. SEAL? Yes. Donovan put the pen down. This was a different kind of look now. Not the initial categorizing look, but something more specific, like he'd put Ryan in a box and now he was taking him back out. She was poisoned, Donovan said. Not a question. The EMT's reaction suggested that was the working theory. Dr. Nanda confirmed it 20 minutes ago. Neurotoxin, something synthetic. Lab's running the full panel, but the profile matches a class of compounds that, he stopped himself, that aren't easy to get or synthesize. Ryan absorbed this. She was a target, he said. Donovan didn't answer that directly. He picked up the pen again. You said you smelled something at the scene. Yes, faint, under the cold air, something chemical, synthetic. Not paint, not fuel, not industrial solvent. He paused. More like something that shouldn't be outside. Donovan wrote that down. You said her jacket. I said she was conscious enough to say she didn't fall. 2 words, barely audible. Didn't fall. She wanted me to know she hadn't just passed out from the cold. And you believed her? I believed her because of what I saw. Nobody who collapses from hypothermia looks like that. Donovan sat back in his chair. He looked at Ryan for a long moment without writing anything. Officer Mercer has been working on something, he said finally. He said it the way you say something you've been deciding whether to say. Off the books. Not officially sanctioned. I was aware of it. I should have pushed her harder to bring it to the table. A pause. There's a network. Moving product through the valley. Not drugs, or not primarily. We've had 3 incidents in the past 8 months that didn't add up to anything by themselves. She thought they added up to something if you lined them up the right way. And nobody took it seriously. Small town, small department. 3 incidents over 8 months looks like coincidence if you're not the one who drove past the same vehicle twice in 2 weeks and wrote it down. He looked at his hands. She wrote it down. Ryan said nothing. He let the silence do the work it was supposed to do. You're going to go look at the park again, aren't you? Donovan said. I'm going to take the dog for a walk. Donovan's expression didn't quite become a smile, but it shifted in that direction. You find anything, you call me. You don't go in anywhere without calling me first. Understood. That's not actually agreement, is it? It's the closest you're getting tonight. Donovan looked at him for another moment, then stood up, tucked the notepad into his jacket. She's lucky you walk at weird hours, he said. He walked toward the elevator. Ryan watched him go. Under his feet, Coda's ear twitched. What? They went back to the park at 11:40. The ambulance had been gone for over 2 hours. The cruiser had been towed. The only evidence that anything had happened was a barely visible depression in the snow on the park bench, rapidly being filled in by the continuing storm. Ryan stood at the bench and took a slow breath through his nose. Nothing. Too much time. Too much fresh snow. He looked at Coda. What do you have? The dog put his nose to the ground near the base of the bench and moved. Not the casual investigative movement of a dog following an interesting smell. The focused, deliberate tracking movement of an animal that has been trained for exactly this and knows it. Ryan followed him. North, as he'd expected. Into the park, past the frozen pond, through the stand of birch trees that gave Birch Avenue its name. The snow was thicker here, the canopy having blocked some of it, and there were marks in the older snow beneath the fresh accumulation. Not quite footprints, the storm had blurred them, but depressions, spaced at intervals that suggested someone moving fast. Moving away. Coda tracked them for nearly a quarter mile through the park and out the north entrance, then across a service road that ran behind the park. And then he stopped. Sat. Looked at Ryan. The scent ended at the service road. Whoever it had been had gotten into a vehicle here. Ryan crouched and looked at the road surface. Beneath the fresh snow, barely visible, the distinct compression pattern of tire tracks. Wide. Heavy vehicle. Something with tread. He photographed it with his phone. Sent the photo to Donovan with a single line. North Service Road behind park. Vehicle waited here. Dog tracked from the bench. He stood up and looked north along the service road. It ran for about a mile before it connected with Route 7, which ran along the base of the mountains toward the lake. Silver Lake was 8 miles north. Ryan stood there in the storm with his hands in his pockets and the cold working its way through the seams of his jacket, thinking about a network that moved product through the valley. About a police officer who had been systematically poisoned with a synthetic neurotoxin by someone who had then walked calmly through a park, gotten into a vehicle, and driven north. About the fact that doing this in a blizzard, on a specific route, at a specific time, required surveillance. It required knowing Ava's patrol pattern. It required someone who had been watching for a while. His phone buzzed. Donovan. Don't go north. I mean it. Ryan looked at the text for a moment. He looked north. He texted back. Going home. Understood. He walked back through the park. Coda walked beside him and glanced up once with an expression that Ryan had come to recognize over 18 months of daily proximity. The dog knew what Ryan was actually thinking. The dog frequently had opinions about it. I know, Ryan said. Coda's ears swiveled forward. Tomorrow, Ryan said. We go north tomorrow. He didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table in the cabin with his laptop open, pulling everything he could find about the valley's incident reports over the past 8 months. 3 incidents Donovan had mentioned. He found 2 of them, a chemical storage violation at a warehouse near the lake that had been cited and dismissed, and a missing persons report for a man named Arthur Pelkey, who had worked, until 3 months ago, as a water treatment technician for the town's municipal system. The 3rd incident wasn't publicly recorded anywhere he could access. He made coffee. Bad coffee from a tin he'd bought at the gas station 3 weeks ago and hadn't replaced because he kept forgetting. He drank it standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the snow coming down through the dark. Ava Mercer was in intensive care with a synthetic neurotoxin in her bloodstream. The snow was erasing the evidence by the hour. Someone in this town, or connected to this town, had access to a compound that was, according to what Donovan had let slip, not easy to get or synthesize. That meant equipment. That meant infrastructure. That meant a fixed location. He looked north. Even from inside, even in the dark, he knew north was out there. The lake, the service road, the mountains behind it. He thought about the warehouse Coda had been tracking toward. He hadn't said that to Donovan. He'd said the scent ended at the service road, which was true. What he hadn't said was that Coda, in his last movement before sitting to signal the end of the trail, had been facing north. Specific and deliberate. The dog wasn't pointing at a vehicle that was already gone. He was pointing at where the vehicle had been going. Ryan closed the laptop and went to the corner of the bedroom where he kept, in a padlocked case, the things he'd brought home that he hadn't figured out what to do with. He opened it. Inside, a compact trauma kit, 2 road flares, a fixed-blade knife in a Kydex sheath, a small handheld radio pre-programmed with emergency frequencies, and his personal sidearm, a Sig Sauer P320, holster separate, both legal, both registered, both sitting in a lockbox in a cabin in a mountain town where he had convinced himself he was just going to rest. He didn't take the weapon. He sat on the edge of the bed. Coda jumped up beside him, which he wasn't supposed to do and did constantly, and put his head in Ryan's lap. Ryan sat there with the snow against the windows and the sound of the wind finding the gaps in the old cabin walls. And he thought about a woman on a bench who had used her last conscious effort to tell him she hadn't fallen. Didn't fall. She'd wanted someone to know it wasn't an accident. She'd been carrying that, whatever she knew, whatever she'd been quietly building toward, and she'd gotten close enough that someone had decided to erase her before she got any closer. And she'd used the last 2 coherent words she had to make sure it wouldn't disappear with her. Ryan put his hand on Coda's head. Okay, he said quietly. Not to the dog exactly, to the room, to the dark outside the window, to whatever version of himself was still listening. Okay. He lay back, stared at the ceiling. He did not sleep. At 6:14 in the morning, his phone rang. The number was County General Hospital. He answered on the second ring. Mr. Mercer. A woman's voice, professional, precise. Dr. Nanda. Officer Mercer is stable. She's asking for you. He sat up. I'll be there in 20. She's quite insistent. A pause. The clinical kind. The kind where a doctor is deciding how much information is relevant. She said, and I'm quoting directly because I want you to understand that this is a woman who should be resting and is instead doing the opposite. She said, tell him not to let them move the truck. Ryan was already putting on his boots. "Tell her I heard," he said. "Mr. Mercer, whatever this woman knows, she should be telling the police, not—" "I'll bring the detective," Ryan said. "Tell her 20 minutes. He ended the call, looked at the window. Dawn was just beginning to gray the sky behind the mountains. Coda was already at the door. Ava Mercer looked like someone had tried to take her apart and hadn't entirely succeeded. The IV lines, the monitors, the pallor, all of it told the story of a body that had been chemically ambushed and was fighting its way back through the aftermath. But her eyes were clear. Whatever the toxin had done, it hadn't touched the thing behind her eyes. That particular focused quality that Ryan would later think of as the thing that had kept her alive. The refusal, even unconscious, to stop paying attention. She looked at him when he came through the door, and she looked at him the way you look at the person who answered when you called. "You found me," she said. "Dog found you." She looked at Coda, who was sitting very correctly just inside the doorway. Her expression changed briefly. Something in it that wasn't quite a smile but was in that direction. "The truck," she said. She turned her head toward Donovan, who was standing against the wall with his arms crossed and his notepad out. "Blue flatbed, partial plate. I wrote it down in my patrol log. KR7 something. Passed it twice in 2 weeks. Different locations, different times. Always heading north." "North to the lake," Donovan said. "North to the lake. The old warehouse district. The facility that was cited and dismissed." Her eyes found Ryan. "The water treatment technician who went missing, Arthur Pelkey. He didn't just walk away, he found something and he ran." "Or he didn't run fast enough," Ryan said. Ava absorbed that. Her jaw tightened. "The attack on me. The way it was done. Whoever synthesized that compound knew what they were doing. That's not backyard chemistry. You need equipment. You need a controlled environment. You need power." "The warehouse," Donovan said. "One of them." She looked at him. "Miles. This is not a small operation. Whatever they're moving, whatever they're producing, it's been running long enough to become infrastructure. And they killed the lights on me before I could prove it." The room was quiet for a moment, except for the soft electric hum of the medical equipment. Ryan looked at the window. Outside, the storm was still going. The snow was still falling, still erasing. "They know you survived," he said. Ava said nothing, which was its own answer. "Which means they know they didn't finish it," he said. "Which means they're either going to run or—" "They're going to accelerate," Ava said. "Whatever the next phase is, they're going to move it up. Before we get organized, before the county gets involved." She looked at Donovan. "How long before you can get a warrant?" Donovan's expression said everything about small departments and county judges at 6 in the morning during a blizzard. "We'll work on it," he said. "Miles. We'll work on it fast." Ryan was looking at Coda. The dog was looking at the door, specifically at the door that led north, out of the building, into the morning. Ava followed his gaze. When she looked back at Ryan, her expression was different. Not the calculated officer expression, not the patient recovering against doctor's orders expression. Something quieter and more direct. "Don't do anything stupid," she said. "No plan to." That's not the same as a no. Ryan looked at her. For a moment he considered saying something reassuring and realized there was no version of reassurance that would actually reassure her, because she was a trained police officer who had spent months quietly building a case on her own, and she knew exactly how investigations moved and exactly what the gaps were. "I'm going to walk the dog," he said. She held his gaze. "North," she said. Not a question. He didn't answer. The monitor beeped. Outside, a gust hit the building and the windows shuddered in their frames. Ava looked away first. She looked at the ceiling, jaw set, hands flat on the bed beside her, and she said something so quietly that Ryan wasn't entirely sure he heard it right. What it sounded like was, "Be careful of the water." He almost asked her to repeat it. But Coda was already moving toward the door, and somewhere north of here, in a warehouse beside a frozen lake, something was being prepared that hadn't been prepared before. And Ryan understood, with the particular bone-deep clarity that only arrives when there's no longer time to doubt it, that whatever the timetable had been before last night, the people who had tried to kill Ava Mercer and failed were now working against a different clock entirely. And so was he. The hospital doors opened into cold that had gotten worse overnight. Ryan pulled his watch cap down and walked to the truck. A 10-year-old Ford F-150 he'd bought off a guy in town 3 weeks ago for $4,200 cash, no questions, which was exactly how he'd wanted it. He got in. Coda jumped into the passenger seat without being invited, which was also standard. The engine turned over on the third try, which was slightly better than yesterday. He sat there for a moment with the heater running and the defroster working slowly on the windshield, looking at nothing. Be careful of the water. He'd almost asked her to repeat it. He hadn't. He was fairly sure he'd heard it right, and if he'd heard it right, it was the most important thing she'd said in that room, and the fact that she'd said it at the volume of a breath rather than at the volume of a warning suggested she wasn't entirely sure she should be saying it at all. Like it was a piece of a puzzle she hadn't fully assembled, and she was handing him the piece anyway because she was in a hospital bed and he was the one walking out the door. He put the truck in drive. Route 7 North was a 2-lane road that ran along the base of the mountain range for about 12 miles before it forked, left toward the county highway, right toward the lake. In summer, it was the kind of drive people took to clear their heads. In February, at 6:40 in the morning, with 6 inches of new snow on the road and the sky the color of old pewter, it was something else. The truck's tires found traction on the compacted snow in the center of the lane, and Ryan kept his speed down and his eyes up and let the road tell him what it wanted to tell him. Coda sat with his nose at the gap in the window Ryan had cracked 2 inches. The dog's nostrils moved in that rapid, almost mechanical way that meant he was cataloging, storing, sorting, running whatever process it was that converted the chemical world into information. Ryan had stopped trying to understand it and started simply paying attention to what the dog did with what he found. 8 miles north, the lake appeared. Silver Lake was 3 miles across at its widest point, frozen solid from the surface down to a depth that the county emergency management website listed as safe for foot traffic, but not vehicle crossings. The shoreline was a mix of pine forest and old industrial infrastructure, the remnants of a small logging operation that had collapsed in the 70s, and after that a series of warehouse and storage facilities that had changed hands several times over the decades. And currently, according to county property records Ryan had pulled at 2 in the morning, belonged to a holding company registered in Delaware with no discernible physical presence anywhere. Ryan knew what that meant. He'd seen it before, in different contexts, in different countries. It meant the facility was owned by the kind of entity that existed specifically to not be found. He pulled over a quarter-mile south of where the service road branched off toward the lake's eastern shoreline. Cut the engine. Sat. From here he could see the top of one building, a flat roof line above the tree line, maybe 150 yards off the main road. No smoke. No obvious light. In the gray morning, with snow still coming down, it looked abandoned, which he supposed was the point. Coda was no longer moving. The dog was rigid, nose at the window gap, every muscle in his body oriented toward the same point on the tree line. "I see it," Ryan said quietly. He reached into the back seat and pulled out the small binoculars he kept in the gear bag. Compact, military surplus, the civilian equivalent of what he'd used for years. He got out of the truck carefully, closed the door without a sound, and moved to the tree line on the road's west side. From 30 feet back in the pines, he glassed the building. What he saw changed the calculation. The warehouse was not abandoned. The roof had a satellite dish mounted on it that was new enough to still have the installer sticker visible through the optics. There were 2 vehicles parked on the south side, a blue flatbed with a partial plate he couldn't make out from this distance, and a dark SUV with what looked like commercial plates. Both had been recently driven. The snow accumulation on them was maybe 2 hours worth rather than overnight. More importantly, the loading bay on the east side of the building had a padlocked roll-up door that had been padlocked from the outside, which meant whoever was inside was not using that entrance, which meant there was another entrance, probably the north face, where the tree line ran close enough to the building to block his sight line. 2 vehicles. Minimum 2 occupants. Unknown what was inside. He lowered the binoculars and thought. This was the part where a rational person called Detective Donovan and said, "I'm parked a quarter-mile south of the eastern shoreline facility, 2 vehicles on site, blue flatbed matches the description." This was the part where a rational person then sat in the truck and waited for backup to materialize, however long that took, however much ground got covered in the meantime. He pulled out his phone, looked at it. "I thought about the water treatment technician named Arthur Pelkey, who had found something and either run or hadn't run fast enough. He thought about the phrase accelerate the timeline. He thought about the fact that in 8 months of quiet, patient operation, these people had done one thing that was conspicuously out of character. They had tried to kill a police officer, aggressively, with a compound that required significant resources to produce. That was not the behavior of an organization that felt comfortable. That was the behavior of an organization that had moved into a phase where loose ends were a liability. He texted Donovan, Eastern Shoreline Facility, 2 vehicles, blue flatbed and dark SUV. Building occupied. Surveillance only, not going in. He put the phone on silent and moved. Awesome. He didn't go straight to the building. He moved north through the pines first, then cut east, using the tree line as cover, keeping his steps in the deeper snow off the compressed surface where footprints would be obvious. It took him 12 minutes to reach the north face. He moved the way he'd been trained to move in terrain like this. Weight forward, rolling from heel to toe, letting the snow absorb the sound rather than fighting it. The north entrance was a personnel door, metal, no window. Beside it, mounted to the exterior wall at about shoulder height, a keypad. And beside the keypad, mounted loosely to the wall with 2 visible screws, an external security camera covering the approach. Ryan stopped in the tree line, 15 yards from the door. The camera was angled to cover the approach from the road, the direction anyone coming legitimately, or not so legitimately but obviously, would come from. From the north, which was where Ryan was, it had approximately 40 degrees of blind spot. He did not move toward the door. Instead, he moved east again, staying in the pines, working his way around to the building's east face. Here, the loading bay door was visible up close, heavy-gauge steel, padlocked, the kind of lock that existed to communicate "don't even try," rather than to actually prevent entry by someone with the right tools. Above the bay door, at the roofline, a ventilation unit, running. He could hear it from where he was standing, the faint mechanical hum that meant climate control, which meant the interior was being maintained at a specific temperature, which meant something inside required a specific temperature. He looked at the ventilation unit for a long moment. Laboratory equipment required climate control. Certain chemical processes required narrow temperature ranges. Pharmaceutical-grade synthesis required both, plus filtration. He thought about what Ava had said. Whatever they're producing, it's been running long enough to become infrastructure. He pulled back into the tree line and made himself stop. He had what he needed. He had confirmation that the facility was active. He had the vehicle descriptions. He had observable evidence of sophisticated infrastructure, satellite, climate control, keypad security. That was inconsistent with a legitimately abandoned warehouse and consistent with what Donovan had described as an operation that was more complex than it appeared. He had, in other words, everything he could get without crossing a line that he'd told Donovan he wouldn't cross. He started back toward the truck. He was 20 yards into the tree line when Coda, who had been moving silently at his left side in the focused, disciplined way that still surprised him sometimes, stopped dead. Ryan stopped with him. One hand on the dog's collar, not squeezing, just contact. Coda's body rotated slightly right. Northeast, toward a point in the tree line ahead and to the right. Ryan did not move. He stood completely still and let his eyes work the area Coda was indicating. Snow. Trees. More trees. The weak gray light filtering through the canopy. Shadows that were just shadows. And then a shape that wasn't. A man, standing in the tree line 40 yards ahead, wearing white-gray winter camouflage and holding something Ryan recognized immediately as a compact AR pattern rifle. Standing very still, the way people who'd been trained to stand still stood still. Not moving, just watching the building, not one of theirs. The angle was wrong. He was watching the building from the north, the same way Ryan had been watching it, and his body language was oriented outward, not guarding the approach, which meant he was external. Surveillance, same as Ryan, or something else. Ryan's hand tightened slightly on Coda's collar. The dog stayed still. Good dog. The figure in the trees moved, just a small shift of weight, and his head turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Ryan was close enough to the trunk of a large pine that the visual break would cover him if the man's eyes came his way. They did. They passed over him. Then the man raised a radio to his mouth and said something Ryan couldn't hear from this distance. And 30 seconds later, the personnel door on the north face of the warehouse opened. So, Ryan was back at the truck in 11 minutes. He was not running. Running created sound and visible movement, and he was still within 300 yards of at least two groups of people with guns. But he moved at the maximum speed consistent with not being noticed. And when he got to the truck, he got in, got Coda in, and pulled away from the shoulder without turning the headlights on until he was 200 yards south with the bend in the road between him and the building. His phone showed 3 texts from Donovan. He read them at the next straight stretch of road. "Don't go near that building." "I mean it, Ryan. Call me." He called. Donovan picked up on half a ring. "Where are you?" "South on 7, heading back toward town." Ryan kept his eyes on the road. "There's another party at the lake." A pause. "What do you mean, another party?" "I mean, someone else was running surveillance on that building from the north side. White-gray winter camo, AR pattern rifle, radio communication. Military trained or trained to look at the way he was standing. When he radioed in, someone inside opened the personnel door." Ryan let that sit for a second. "This isn't just a local operation, Donovan. Someone else is watching it, and whoever's inside knows they're being watched and is communicating with the watcher." Silence on the line. The kind of silence that meant the person on the other end was recalibrating. "You need to come in," Donovan said. "I'm on my way." "Ryan." A beat. "What you just described, but that's not a county sheriff situation anymore. That's—" "I know what it is." Another silence. "How do you know what it is?" Ryan didn't answer that. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, he said, and ended the call. Well, Donovan was waiting in the parking lot of the Black Ridge Crossing PD, which was a 6-person department operating out of a building that had previously been a dental office and still had the frosted glass window in the waiting area that had once said "Smile" in reversed letters. He was standing in the snow without a hat, which suggested he'd come out in a hurry. "Get inside," he said. The building was warm in the way of spaces heated just enough to be technically habitable. The dispatcher on duty was a different one from last night, a woman in her 40s named Helen who had a mug of tea and the expression of someone who had seen too much to be easily surprised. She glanced at Coda and returned to her screen without comment. Donovan sat across from Ryan at a desk that had too many papers on it and too few answers. He had a tablet open with a satellite image of the Eastern Shoreline facility. The image was recent enough that Ryan could see the satellite dish on the roof. "You were closer than surveillance only," Donovan said. "Don't insult me. I assessed from the tree line. I didn't approach the structure." Semantic difference. "It's a meaningful difference." Donovan leaned back in his chair. The chair complained about it. "The holding company that owns the facility, it routes through 3 shell entities before you hit anything with a physical address. The address turns out to be a mailbox store in Wilmington, Delaware." He pulled the tablet toward him and turned it around so Ryan could see the screen. "Arthur Pelkey, the missing water treatment tech. He put in for vacation 3 months ago. He was due back from vacation 6 weeks ago. The department did a wellness check. His apartment was empty. Personal effects gone, like he'd packed." Donovan's finger tapped the screen. "Here's what's interesting. 2 weeks before he requested vacation, Pelkey filed a maintenance report on the town's water intake manifold. Said there was an anomalous pressure differential in the secondary intake line. The report was reviewed, marked routine maintenance, closed." He looked at Ryan. "The intake manifold connects to 2 main lines. One serves the residential distribution network. The other serves the emergency backup supply for the whole valley, including the hospital, the school, the municipal buildings." Ryan looked at the satellite image. Then he looked at Donovan. "Ava said to be careful of the water." Donovan closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, he looked older than he had in the hospital room. "I know. If someone contaminated the secondary intake, the whole valley gets it, every tap, every pipe." Donovan's voice was careful and flat, the tone of a man holding something at arm's length so he could think about it clearly. "The toxin they used on Ava, Dr. Nanda says the dose she received was sublethal but significant. A water distribution concentration wouldn't have to be as high to cause mass casualties if the exposure was sustained. People drinking it, showering in it, people in the hospital on IV lines." He stopped himself. The room was very quiet. Helen at the dispatch desk had stopped typing. "They're not just moving product," Ryan said. "No. This is the product." Donovan said nothing. Ryan looked at the satellite image again. The facility. The two vehicles. The man in the tree line with the radio. The personnel door opening. The man I saw in the trees. The one in Camo. He wasn't protecting the facility. The angle was wrong. He was watching it from outside. He worked through it. If I had to guess, he's either a buyer verifying the delivery, or he's the next link in the chain. The people inside produce it. The people outside pick it up and move it somewhere else, or they're confirming it's ready to move. Which means the timeline is now, or close to now. That's why Ava scared them. She was close enough that they couldn't wait anymore. Donovan stood up and went to the window. He stood there with his back to Ryan for a moment, looking at the snow. I can get a county warrant, he said. 4 hours, maybe 6. Judge Crawford is slow in the morning, and she's going to want documentation. 6 hours. Maybe 4. Ryan did the math on what could move in 4 to 6 hours and said nothing. I know, Donovan said without turning around. What about the state police? Already made the call. Donovan turned back. They're coming from 50 miles south, road conditions. He spread his hands in a gesture that said everything the words didn't need to. Ryan looked at Coda. The dog was lying under the desk with his chin on his front paws, watching Ryan with calm, dark eyes. You're not going to wait, Donovan said. It wasn't an accusation. It was more like a man reading a map. I'm going to go back and maintain surveillance, Ryan said. External. If something moves, I call you immediately. Ryan. I'll call you immediately. Donovan looked at him for a long moment. You have any training in hazmat? The question was specific enough that Ryan understood it wasn't purely rhetorical. Basic CBRN protocols, enough to not contaminate myself and to identify exposure signs. The toxin they used on Ava, Donovan hesitated. Dr. Nanda sent the preliminary tox profile to the state lab last night. They called back this morning. The compound is a modified organophosphate. Contact exposure, inhalation, or ingestion. He held Ryan's gaze. If those containers are open or cracked, the area around the facility could be, I won't go in without calling. I'm serious. So am I. Donovan picked up his own jacket from the back of his chair and started putting it on. Then I'm coming with you. Ryan looked at him. I'm the lead detective on an attempted murder investigation involving a serving police officer, Donovan said, pulling his collar up. I have standing to conduct surveillance on a location connected to that investigation. I don't need a warrant to stand in a public tree line and look at a building. He looked back at Ryan. You going to argue with me? Ryan considered it. No. Good. Donovan picked up his radio and his keys. Helen. I heard everything, Helen said without looking up from her screen. I've got the county judge's number ready. I'll call you when the warrant's through. 2 vehicles in my name to the Eastern Shore facility. Do not send anyone without my authorization. Understood. She looked up briefly. Detective. She looked at Coda. Nice dog. Coda's tail moved once. They took Ryan's truck because Donovan's department vehicle would be visible on the road in a way that a battered private F-150 wouldn't be. Donovan sat in the passenger seat. Coda had been relocated to the back with some pointed dignity, and they drove north on Route 7 in the gray morning with the heat going and the radio silent between them. About halfway there, Donovan said, How many deployments? Ryan kept his eyes on the road. 4. Iraq? Iraq and Afghanistan. 1 in an advisory capacity in a location I can't specify. Long time. 11 years. Donovan looked out the passenger window at the passing tree line. My son did 2 tours, Marines. He came back. He paused, reconsidered. He's all right now. It took a while. Ryan didn't say anything. Sometimes the right response to something was just to let it exist. You got family here? Donovan asked. No? Just came back to the town. Just came back to the town. Donovan looked at him sideways. How long were you planning to stay? I hadn't decided. Well, Donovan looked back at the road. You might want to decide after this. Ryan said nothing to that either. He was thinking about what Ava had said. They're going to accelerate. And about the man in the trees with the radio, and about 2 vehicles in a lot that hadn't been there overnight, and about an intake manifold with an anomalous pressure differential that a trained technician had flagged, and that nobody had done anything about. He was also thinking about something he hadn't mentioned to Donovan yet, something he'd seen in the last seconds before he'd pulled back from the tree line that morning, when the personnel door had opened and the man in camo had disappeared inside. It had been fast, a 2-second window, and the light had been bad and the distance significant, but Ryan had spent 11 years training his eyes to extract information from exactly these conditions. In those 2 seconds, before the door closed, he had seen the interior of the warehouse. Not much, just a slice of it. But enough. Large space, overhead fluorescent lighting, metal shelving units along one visible wall, and on the concrete floor near the door, what he was nearly certain were 2 large chemical drums, the kind used for bulk liquid storage, with yellow hazard labels. Not the small-scale lab equipment he'd half expected, not the improvised synthesis setup of a local operation. Industrial scale. He'd said nothing about this to Donovan because he was still processing what it meant. And what it meant was that whoever was operating out of that building wasn't producing a small amount of a compound that could be used to poison one police officer or even a handful of targets. They were producing enough to do something that required industrial quantities. He thought about water, about the intake manifold, about sustained exposure through a distribution network. He gripped the steering wheel and said nothing, and the truck moved north through the snow, and Silver Lake appeared ahead of them through the trees, flat and white and utterly still, the way it had been every winter he could remember. It had never looked threatening before. They were still a quarter-mile out when Donovan's radio crackled. Helen's voice. "Detective, movement on the Eastern Shore Road. County Dispatch just flagged a call. Anonymous tip, landline from a payphone on Route 7, stated there was, I'm quoting, smoke coming from the old warehouse by the lake." Ryan and Donovan looked at each other. "Anonymous tip," Donovan said. "From a payphone," Ryan said, "on Route 7. Which means someone who was at the lake just drove south and called it in from the gas station at mile marker 4. Donovan was already on the radio. "Helen?" "Who responded?" "Nobody yet. I was waiting for your authorization." "Do not send anyone. Do you hear me? Do not send a unit to that location. I need you to call the county hazmat team and tell them..." The explosion wasn't large. It wasn't the kind of explosion that rattles windows a mile away. It was more of a deep, compressed concussion, the kind that moves through the ground as much as through the air, felt in the chest before it was heard with the ears. Ryan had heard that sound before. He knew exactly what it meant. Controlled demolition, small charge, shaped to destroy specific infrastructure without bringing down the whole structure. They were burning the evidence. Ryan floored the truck. Donovan grabbed the dash with one hand and the radio with the other. "Helen, county hazmat, now, and get me state police ETA." 12 minutes out, Helen said immediately, and Ryan had 3 seconds to be grateful that she'd been anticipating this before the tree line opened up, and the Eastern Shoreline facility came into view, and everything changed again. The warehouse was not on fire, not the structure itself. What was burning was the south side of the lot, a controlled burn that had taken out what looked like a transport vehicle, the blue flatbed, reduced now to a burning frame with black smoke climbing into the gray sky and a column that would be visible for 5 miles in any direction, which was almost certainly intentional. Draw attention here, force response here, while something else happened somewhere else. "The dark SUV," Ryan said. Donovan saw it at the same moment. The dark SUV was not in the lot. The dark SUV was gone. Tracks in the snow leading north along the shoreline road, fresh, recent, moving fast. North along the shoreline road went to one place, the water intake pumping station. Donovan was already on the radio. Ryan was already turning the truck north, following the tracks, the burning flatbed in the mirror, the smoke climbing, Coda in the back seat standing with his paws on the center console and his body leaning forward like he already knew where they were going. "Helen, I need you to find me the location of the municipal water intake pumping station on the north shore of Silver Lake," Donovan said into the radio. His voice was level, professional. The voice of a man who had been doing this long enough to know that panic was a resource expenditure with no return on investment. Helen's response came back in 20 seconds. "North Shore, mile marker 2 on the Lakeside Road. Access road off the main route. Detective, it's unmanned, automated system, monitored remotely." "Who monitors it?" A pause. "According to county records, It's contracted to a private facilities management company registered in... Helen stopped. Helen. Delaware, she said. It's registered in Delaware. The truck hit a patch of bad ice and fishtailed. Ryan corrected without lifting his foot from the accelerator. The tire tracks in front of them were clear in the snow, two parallel lines pointing north, pointing toward a pumping station that controlled the water supply for 4,000 people in this valley. He thought about yellow hazard labels on industrial drums. He thought about sustained exposure through distribution. He thought about Ava in a hospital bed, keeping her voice at barely a breath. Be careful of the water. He pushed the truck harder and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say, and the lake stretched out to their right, frozen and white and silent. And somewhere ahead of them on the north shore, a dark SUV was moving fast toward something that had been planned for a very long time. The tire tracks cut north along the shoreline road like a scar in fresh skin, sharp-edged and recent. The SUV may be 4 minutes ahead of them. Ryan didn't need Donovan to tell him to push it. He already had the truck at the edge of what the road could handle, which wasn't much, a single lane of packed snow with a 2-foot drop on the lakeside and a wall of pine on the other, the kind of road that existed on county maps as a maintenance access route and in practice as something you drove only if you had a reason and knew what you were doing. The F-150 took the curves hard and came out of them straight, and Ryan kept both hands low on the wheel, thumbs out, letting his arms absorb the corrections rather than fighting them. Coda was still standing with his paws on the center console. The dog's eyes were forward. Talk to me about the pumping station, Ryan said. Donovan had his phone out, pulling up whatever he could get. Automated intake system, built in 1987, upgraded in 2009. Serves the primary residential distribution network and the emergency backup supply. There's a main control manifold. That's the one Pelkey flagged. Secondary intake valve, manually operated as a backup to the automated system. He looked up from the phone. If someone bypasses the automated controls and opens the secondary intake manually, whatever's in the line goes straight into the distribution network, without triggering any of the automated monitoring. Because the monitoring is managed by the same company that owns the warehouse. Donovan put the phone down. Yeah. Ryan said nothing to that. He pressed the accelerator a fraction harder, and the truck responded with the slide that he caught before it became anything serious. The access road appeared on the left, a gap in the tree line marked by a small green county sign that said, Water Intake Access, No Unauthorized Entry. The SUV's tracks turned left. Ryan turned left. The road immediately worsened, narrowing to barely wider than the truck. The trees close enough on both sides that branches scraped the mirrors. The snow here was deeper, untouched except for the tracks in front of them, and the light was worse, the canopy closing overhead and reducing the gray morning sky to thin strips. 90 seconds down the access road, the tree line broke open. The pumping station sat at the water's edge, backed up against the lake's north shore. It was a utilitarian concrete structure, single story, maybe 40 feet long by 20 wide, with a flat roof and no windows on the visible faces. 2 large pipe housings emerged from the back wall and disappeared into the ice at the shoreline. A chain-link fence surrounded the perimeter, gate standing open. Not forced open, the chain was cut, but recently, the cut end still shiny where it wasn't covered in snow. The dark SUV was parked 20 feet from the station's entrance, driver door still open. No one visible. Ryan stopped the truck 30 yards back, cut the engine. How many you think? Donovan said. His voice was quiet now. Tactical quiet. The conscious decision to reduce the acoustic signature of their presence. Minimum 2 from the warehouse, plus whoever was in the tree line. Ryan was looking at the building, the fence, the SUV, running the geometry. 3 to 5, depending on how they split the load. The tree line guy may have been the coordinator. If he went inside to supervise the final stage, 5 people. Maybe. And we have 2. Donovan looked at Ryan. And a dog. And a dog, Ryan confirmed. Donovan put his hand on his radio, then stopped. If I call in right now, I bring state police and county. They come in with lights and noise, and whoever's inside knows we're here before we can stop them from turning that valve. Yes. And if we go in, there are 5 armed people who have already demonstrated they're willing to use a chemical weapon on a law enforcement officer. Ryan looked at the station. And a contamination risk we can't quantify from here. Donovan sat with that for 3 seconds. I hate this. I know. What would you do if it was your call? Ryan looked at him. The question was genuine, not rhetorical, not a challenge. A detective who had spent 30 years working inside a system that had rules for situations like this, asking a man who had spent 11 years in situations where the rules existed, but the world didn't always cooperate. I'd get close enough to know what we're walking into before I committed to either option, Ryan said. Donovan picked up his radio. Helen, I need state police to come in quiet, so no lights, no sirens. Stop 1 mile south of the access road and wait for my signal. Can you relay that? Relaying now, Helen said immediately. Tell them we have a potential contamination situation. They need hazmat ready to move the moment I give the word. Copy. Donovan put the radio on the seat, looked at Ryan. Get close enough, he said. Ryan was already out of the truck. He moved along the fence line on the west side, using the SUV as visual cover from the station's entrance, keeping low. Coda moved with him. Not on the leash, no leash in a situation like this. The dog operating on the same instincts that had made him functional in environments where obedience wasn't enough, and judgment was the difference. Ryan had hand-signaled heel before he'd gotten 10 feet from the truck, and Coda had matched him step for step since then, ears rotating, processing. The station's entrance was a steel door on the south face. It was closed. Ryan moved to the corner of the fence line and crouched, getting eyes on the entrance from a position that kept the SUV between him and the door. He listened. Inside the building, voices. He couldn't make words at this distance, but he could make register. At least 3 voices, 2 of which were in an exchange that had the rhythm of authority and response. Instructions being given. Somebody was running this. And underneath the voices, a sound he recognized immediately. The low mechanical grinding of heavy equipment under manual load. Something was being turned. Something that required significant physical effort. The valve. He pressed his back to the fence post and thought fast. The grinding meant they were in the process of opening the secondary intake manually. Not already open, still in process. That meant there was still time, but still time was measured in how fast a large manual valve could be turned, and he had no information on that. He pulled back to the corner and moved at a low run back along the fence to where Donovan had repositioned, 20 yards west of the truck in the tree line. 3 confirmed inside, maybe more, Ryan said quietly. I can hear the valve. It's not open yet. Donovan's jaw tightened. How long? No idea. Minutes. Could be less. State police are 7 minutes out. Ryan looked at him. 7 minutes was not a number that solved this problem. Donovan knew it too. He had the expression of a man watching 2 timelines converge on a point that was going to be bad no matter which one arrived first. If we breach, we're walking into a room with armed people and an open contamination risk. If we don't breach, they open that valve, and 7 minutes becomes irrelevant. Ryan, Donovan's voice dropped to something that was almost not a voice. I can't order you to go in there. I can't, officially, professionally, I cannot ask a civilian to breach an armed installation. Ryan looked at the building. You're not asking. A pause. No, Donovan said. I'm not asking. Ryan looked at Coda. The dog was sitting, watching his face with those dark, calm eyes. Waiting for the word. Ryan put his hand on the dog's neck for 1 second. Not a pat. Just contact. Just the particular weight of a hand that meant I know you're here. Stay close, he said quietly. On my signal. Coda's ears came forward. Ryan went over the fence because the gate was on the south side, and the south side had the door, and he wasn't going through the door first, not without knowing the interior layout, not without knowing where the people inside were standing. He went over the west fence in a single movement, hands on the top bar, body following in a controlled rotation that brought him down on the other side in a crouch without a sound. Old muscle memory, the kind that doesn't negotiate with age or rust or 11 months of trying to become a civilian. He moved along the outside wall toward the building's west face. No windows. Concrete cold under his gloved hand. The voices were louder now. He could almost make words. And the grinding was louder too, and there was another sound layered under it that raised every hair on his body. Liquid. Moving through pipes under pressure. Not fast. Not yet. A ventilation panel on the west wall, low down, 12 by 18 inches, steel mesh cover. Ryan crouched beside it and put his ear close. Almost there, keep it moving. Pressure's equalizing. You'll feel it release. How long before it reaches the main distribution junction? A voice that was different from the others. Older, measured, with the kind of flat precision that Ryan associated with people who had planned things for a long time and were watching them unfold. 40 minutes to the first residential tap at current flow rate. 60 to full saturation of the primary network. By the time anyone notices anything wrong, we're 6 hours north. Silence for 2 seconds. Then, and the secondary? The hospital connects to the secondary at the emergency junction. Same flow rate. Ryan moved. Not toward the door, away from it. East along the building's back wall, toward the pipe housings at the water's edge. He found what he was looking for in 6 seconds. A secondary access panel for manual equipment maintenance. The kind that exists on every water infrastructure installation because regulations require human access to every mechanically operated component. It was padlocked. The padlock was old. The screws holding the panel housing to the wall were not. He didn't have tools. What he had was 11 years of operating in environments where improvisation was not a last resort, but a primary methodology. The fixed blade knife in its Kydex sheath came out and went to work on the screws. Not fast, not clean. The blade was the wrong tool for this, and he knew it. But it was the tool he had, and he worked through it with the focused, deliberate patience of someone who understands that the margin between hurrying and going too fast is the difference between a problem solved and a problem compounded. 40 seconds. The panel swung free. He was through. The interior of the pumping station was not large. The main room was maybe 30 feet across. Concrete floor, overhead fluorescents, the mechanical guts of the intake system dominating the center space. Pipe manifolds, valve assemblies, pressure gauges, electrical panels. It smelled like metal and cold water, and something else, something sharp and chemical, faint enough that Ryan registered it as background but didn't let himself focus on it yet. 5 men. He counted them in the first second. 3 near the central manifold assembly, where a large manual valve wheel, maybe 2 feet in diameter, mounted horizontally, was being turned by 2 of them in alternating pulls, red-faced with effort. A 4th man stood by the electrical panel, watching a pressure readout, and the 5th stood near the door, back to Ryan, pistol on his hip. Ryan had come through the maintenance panel into the northwest corner of the room, behind a cluster of vertical pipe housing that gave him 3 seconds of cover before anyone looking in his direction would register movement. He used 2 of those seconds to take inventory of everything he needed to know, which was what he'd been trained to do. Entry points, positions, weapons visible, lines of sight, priority targets. The man at the door was the immediate threat because he was armed and could give an alarm. The 2 at the valve wheel were occupied and temporarily compromised. Turning a large manual valve under load was exactly as physically demanding as it looked. The man at the electrical panel was a variable. The 5th, the voice he'd heard through the vent, the one with the flat, planned precision. That was the man standing slightly back from the valve assembly, watching the pressure gauge over the electrical panel guy's shoulder. I was the oldest of the 5 by a decade, salt and pepper haircut close, wearing a dark insulated jacket with no identifying markings. He was also the only one facing in Ryan's general direction. Ryan had 3 seconds. He used the 3rd one. He came out from behind the pipe housing at an angle that kept him in the door guard's blind spot, crossed the 12 feet between them in 4 strides on concrete that he couldn't make silent, but could make fast enough that the processing time was the guard's problem. And the moment the guard's body started to rotate toward the sound, Ryan was already inside his reach, one hand on the gun hand at the wrist, locking the draw. Elbow across the throat. Not a strike, a block, turning the guard's own balance against him, controlling the fall backward so it was quiet rather than crashing. Down to the floor in 2 seconds. The gun out of the holster and in Ryan's hand in the 3rd. The man was conscious. Ryan put a knee on his chest and his forearm across his throat and said, directly into his ear, at a volume that was barely more than breath, "Don't." The man went still. One of the men at the valve wheel said, "What was that?" without looking up. Nobody answered. Ryan's eyes went to the 5th man, the planner, who was looking directly at him now. Their eyes met across 30 feet of concrete and fluorescent light. The planner did not reach for a weapon. He did not shout a warning. He looked at Ryan with the particular expression of someone recalibrating, and he said quietly and distinctly, "Whoever you are, you're too late. The valve is 3/4 open." Ryan looked at the valve wheel. The two men had stopped turning it and were turning around, registering the situation. Guard on the floor, unknown person with a weapon, their boss speaking to them calmly. Like this was a business meeting that had encountered a procedural complication. "Who are you?" the planner said. "Nobody," Ryan said. "Nobody doesn't move like that." "Get away from the valve." The planner looked at him with genuine interest, the way a chess player looks at an unexpected move. "The automation monitoring is disabled. The backup alarm is disabled. Even if you stop the wheel this moment, and I'm going to suggest that stopping me from stopping the wheel might be more complicated than you're currently accounting for. The flow pressure is already sufficient to move the compound past the first junction point. The only way to stop it now is the emergency bypass shutoff, which requires a specific code, and what's the code?" A pause. The planner looked at him for a moment. "No." Ryan raised the gun. "You won't shoot me," the planner said, "because if you shoot me, the code dies with me. And you don't know where the bypass shutoff is in this room, and you have—" He glanced at the pressure gauge. "Perhaps 6 minutes before the compound clears the junction and the distribution network is beyond any mechanical intervention." The two men at the valve wheel had separated, one moving left, one right, widening Ryan's angle problem. The man at the electrical panel had his hand behind his back. Ryan tracked all of it. He didn't let his eyes do the normal human thing of fixing on the primary threat and losing the periphery. 11 years of close-quarters work had, among other things, fundamentally rewired whatever instinct made civilian eyes narrow their field under stress. He saw all 5 of them, all the time. But the planner was right about one thing. Ryan was one person, and the geometry of 5 was not a geometry that resolved cleanly in his favor without the gun becoming a more active part of the conversation than he wanted, in a room with an open chemical compound and no ventilation. He made a decision. Coda. He didn't shout it. Normal voice. The word carried because the room was concrete and the room was quiet. The maintenance panel at the northwest corner exploded open, and 90 pounds of German Shepherd came through it like a thing that had been compressed under enormous pressure and suddenly released. And the man at the electrical panel, the one with his hand moving towards something behind his back, got approximately 1 second to register what was coming before Coda arrived. The bite was textbook. Forearm, high, taking the hand and the weapon potential in one movement, the dog's momentum carrying the man sideways into the electrical panel with a crash that shook the gauges in their housings. The man shouted. Coda held. Ryan moved. He took the man on his right first, the one who'd separated from the valve wheel. Because right was his strong side and the angle was tighter, not the gun. He didn't want the gun discharging in a room with an unknown airborne contamination risk, and 5 people in it, including himself. The gun went into his waistband and his hands did what they'd been trained to do, which was resolve a close-range threat quickly and with minimum collateral noise, and the man went down in 4 seconds and stayed there. The second man from the valve wheel came at him from the left, which was not ideal but was anticipated. Ryan took the impact across his left shoulder. He'd been injured there 2 years ago in a situation he did not permit himself to think about right now, and used the man's forward momentum the way you use water, redirecting rather than stopping, putting the man's face into the edge of a pipe housing. Down. Left shoulder was sending him specific information now that he set aside for later. The guard he'd taken at the door was getting up. Ryan looked at him. The man looked at Ryan. At the 2 men on the floor. At the dog, which was maintaining a bite hold on the 4th man with professional patience. The guard made the calculation that most people in his position made when the math stopped working in their favor. He put his hands up. Ryan looked at the planner. The planner had not moved during any of it. He was standing in the same position, hands at his sides, watching. His expression was not afraid. It was something more contained than afraid. The expression of a man who had prepared for multiple outcomes and was observing which one had arrived. "The bypass shut off," Ryan said. His breathing was elevated but controlled. Left shoulder was a problem he was temporarily ignoring. "Now." "You have approximately 4 minutes," the planner said. "Then you have 2 seconds to decide whether you want to spend them giving me the code or watching the dog finish with your associate." A pause. Long enough to be a statement. "West wall," the planner said. Behind the red emergency panel cover, code is 94721. Ryan moved to the west wall without taking his eyes off the planner. The red panel cover, he found it in 2 seconds, bolted flat to the wall, the kind of cover that existed to prevent accidental activation. He put the gun in his waistband again, got both hands on the cover, pulled. Behind it, a manual bypass assembly. Simpler than the main system, designed to be operated under duress by someone who wasn't a trained technician. A large lever, spring-loaded, currently in the open position. A digital keypad with a green ready light. Beside the keypad, in faded stenciled letters, emergency bypass authorized code required. Ryan punched in 94721. The ready light went red, then amber. The display read, verify code. He punched it again. The lever assembly made a sound, a deep hydraulic clunk from somewhere inside the wall, and then the green light returned and the display changed. Bypass engaged. Intake flow. Arrested. And then, in smaller text below, flow reversal initiated. Contaminated volume. Estimated 340 gallons. Containment protocol active. Ryan stood at the panel for 1 second and let himself breathe. Just 1 second. Behind him, he heard the planner say, "Impressive. You've bought them a few hours." Ryan turned. "The distribution junction," the planner said. "The volume that cleared the manifold before you engaged the bypass. It's already in the secondary line." He tilted his head. Not gloating. Something worse than gloating. Something that was almost academic in its detachment. "You've stopped the source, but you haven't stopped what's already moving." Ryan looked at him. 340 gallons is a significant volume, Mr. The planner paused. "You still haven't told me who you are. Where's the junction shut off for the secondary line?" "That," the planner said, "is at the main water treatment facility, which is on the south end of town, which is—" He checked his watch. Actual watch. Analog. The gesture was deliberate, the kind of deliberateness that existed to communicate, "I'm not afraid of you." "Approximately 8 minutes from here, by road." "In good conditions," Ryan said. "Yes." "What's the code for the junction shut-off?" "I'm afraid I don't know that one." Ryan looked at him steadily. The planner looked back. Neither of them moved. "You'll have to have your police contact the treatment facility," the planner said, "assuming they can reach the on-call operator in time. The facility has a manual emergency protocol, but it requires physical access and a specific how long before the contaminated volume reaches the first residential tap. At current flow pressure in the secondary line? Reduced now, of course, because you've arrested the intake. But what's already in the line, the planner did what might have been a calculation in his head. 30 minutes, perhaps, closer to 25. Donovan hit the door. He came through it with his service weapon drawn and his badge out, and the particular look of a man who had been standing outside a building for 4.5 minutes, listening to what sounded like several bad things happening, and was arriving after the fact at a controlled scene that was not what he'd expected. He took in the room in one sweep. Men on the floor. Coda still holding the man by the electrical panel. Ryan standing at the west wall with blood on his jacket from the shoulder, looking at a man in a dark coat who was standing with his hands at his sides with an expression of absolute composure. "Miles," Ryan said. "The emergency treatment facility, south end of town, secondary line junction shut off. We have 25 minutes. Donovan was already on the radio. He crossed the room in 4 strides and put his hand on the planner's arm, and the planner allowed himself to be turned and his hands brought behind his back without resistance. And the whole time his eyes stayed on Ryan with that particular focused quality of someone memorizing something they expect to need later. "Mercer," Donovan said into the radio, walking the planner toward the door. Then to Ryan, "State police are 2 minutes out. Stay with them until—" "Go," Ryan said. Donovan looked at him. "Miles, go. I've got this." Donovan held his gaze for 1 second, made a decision, and went. The door swung shut behind him. Ryan stood in the sudden quiet of the pumping station, the fluorescent hum, the residual mechanical sounds of arrested flow, the soft sound of Coda on the floor with his bite now released, standing over the man at the electrical panel who was not going anywhere. And he looked at the bypass panel on the wall with its green light and its message about containment protocol and 340 gallons. He thought about 25 minutes. He thought about the treatment facility 8 minutes south by road. He thought about the fact that Donovan was already in his vehicle and already moving. And then he thought about something else. The planner had said you've bought them a few hours after the bypass engaged, and then immediately shifted to talking about the secondary line junction. As if the bypass buying a few hours was a known variable. As if the problem he was pointing Ryan toward was designed to be pointed toward. As if there was a third thing. Ryan turned from the bypass panel slowly. He looked at the room, at the 4 men on the floor and against the wall. At the electrical panel the 4th man had been standing at when Coda had arrived. The panel that the man had been reaching for something behind. He walked to it. Behind the man's former position, on the floor against the baseboard, was a small device. Compact. Black plastic housing, roughly the size of a thick paperback book. 2 lights on it, one green, one not yet illuminated. A digital display. A keypad. It had not been there when he'd entered the room. The man had placed it, or been in the process of placing it, before Coda had interrupted him. Ryan crouched and looked at it without touching it. The digital display read, armed, countdown, inactive, trigger, remote, remote, trigger. The planner had a phone. Of course he had a phone. He'd walked out of here with his hands cuffed and Donovan's grip on his arm. And Donovan had not, because there was no reason he would have, searched him for a phone first. Ryan stood up. He was running before he got to the door. Behind him, through the walls of the pumping station, he heard it. The first sound of state police sirens 2 minutes out, exactly as Donovan had said. Coming in quiet had been the plan. But the planner had known the timeline on that too. He'd known it because he'd been listening to the radio frequencies that law enforcement used in this county. Because an organization that had been running an operation in this valley for 8 months without getting caught had done its homework. And the radio frequencies of the Black Ridge Crossing PD were not encrypted and not difficult to monitor. The trigger was remote. Donovan had the planner. Donovan was in a vehicle. Ryan hit the station door and it came open and the cold hit him and he was across the lot in 6 strides, through the gate. And he could see Donovan's unmarked car 40 yards down the access road, moving, and he could see through the rear window the shape of 2 heads, Donovan driving, the planner in the back seat. And he shouted Donovan's name into the winter air, and the sound went nowhere in the wind and the pines. He ran. His left shoulder was loud now, something in it that wasn't just bruised, sending sharp, specific information up into his neck and down into his fingers. And he ran through it the way he'd run through things before, because there are times when the body's protests are relevant information, and there are times when they are noise, and right now they were noise. 40 yards, 30. Donovan's brake lights came on. Ryan reached the driver's side window in the same moment it came down, and Donovan looked at him, at his face, at the shoulder, at whatever was in his expression, and said, "What?" "He has a phone," Ryan said. "Remote trigger, device in the building. If he activates it." In the back seat, the planner looked at Ryan through the window with those calm, recalibrating eyes. And he smiled. His right hand, which Donovan had cuffed to his left behind his back, but which was now, because the right wrist had something wrong with it, because the cuffs had not closed fully on a wrist that was wrapped in what Ryan now registered as a thin, rigid brace, a medical brace, something that had kept the mechanism from seating, was not behind his back anymore. It was at his side. And in his palm was a phone. Ryan's hand was through the window before the planner's thumb reached the screen, and the planner's wrist came up against the door frame at an angle that made the phone fall from his hand and bounce off the seat. And for 3 seconds there was nothing in the car but the sound of Ryan breathing hard and Donovan shouting something and the phone lying face up on the back seat with the screen showing an open app and a single large button that said Initiate. Ryan looked at the phone. The planner looked at Ryan. "It requires a second authentication," Ryan said. The planner said nothing. "It's on a timer," Ryan said, "or it requires GPS confirmation that you're at a safe distance. That's why you waited until you were in the car and moving." The planner's composure, which had been remarkable throughout all of it, shifted. Not broke. Just shifted. A micro-expression, the kind that comes and goes in less than a second but tells you everything, the way a hairline crack tells you about the structure it runs through. It was enough. Ryan reached through the window and picked up the phone off the seat and looked at the screen. The Initiate button. Below it, in smaller text, Confirm location, safe zone required. Minimum 800 m from target. He looked at the distance readout in the app's corner, 340 m. The device in the building was not going to fire. Not from here. Not unless the planner got 800 meters away first. Ryan looked up at Donovan. Don't let him out of your sight, and keep him under 800 meters from this building until the state police have that device secured. Donovan looked at the phone, at the app, at the distance readout. The calculation moved across his face in real time. How did you know? Donovan said. Ryan thought about it for a second, about what he'd actually known and when, about the planner's shift from the bypass code to the secondary line, the redirect, about the fact that a man who had planned for 8 months was not a man who operated without contingencies, about the device on the floor that had been placed to be missed in the chaos of a room with 5 people and a dog. He was too easy, Ryan said. The code. He gave it to me too fast. He straightened up. Left shoulder informed him of its situation. A man who won't tell you his name gives you an emergency code in 30 seconds. It's because the emergency code isn't the thing you should be worried about. Donovan stared at him. 8 minutes to the treatment facility, Ryan said. 20 minutes left on the secondary line. Go. Donovan looked at him for one more second. That particular look again, the look of a man reassessing the box he'd put someone in. And then he put the car in drive. Ryan stood on the access road and watched the taillights go, and then he turned and walked back through the gate and into the pumping station to wait for the state police. And his left shoulder was a serious problem now, and Coda was sitting beside him, matching him step for step, and the green light on the bypass panel was still lit, and outside the lake was flat and white and silent under the gray sky. And somewhere south of here, Donovan was driving through snow at the edge of what was safe, and the morning was not over yet. Not even close. The state police arrived in 2 vehicles, no sirens, and they came in fast enough that the snow kicked up behind their tires in small rooster tails that the wind took immediately. Ryan was standing at the pumping station entrance when they pulled through the gate. 4 officers, tactical gear, the kind of coordinated entry posture that told him these were not the highway patrol guys who spent their days writing speeding tickets on Route 7. The lead officer, a woman, late 30s, dark hair pulled back, the name Vasquez on her vest, took one look at the scene inside the station and then one look at Ryan and did the same calculation Donovan and Garcia, the EMT, had done before her. You cleared this? She said. 4 detained, 1 in custody with Detective Donovan, 1 device on the floor by the east electrical panel. Remote trigger requires GPS confirmation at 800 meters minimum, so keep your man in that building. Ryan pointed at the device without approaching it. I haven't touched it. I don't know if it has a secondary trigger on a timer. Vasquez looked at the device, looked at the 4 men on the floor and against the wall, 3 of whom were conscious and none of whom looked interested in causing further problems. Coda sat near the electrical panel with the calm authority of a dog who has decided he is responsible for a specific geographic area. Hazmat, Ryan said. 10 minutes behind us. Vasquez was already directing her team, 2 on the detained subjects, 1 establishing a perimeter, 1 on the radio. The bypass panel, is that active? Green light, intake arrested. The display shows containment protocol running 340 gallons in the line between the intake manifold and the secondary junction. He paused. Donovan is headed to the treatment facility to shut the junction. We have a unit going there too. Vasquez looked at him fully for the first time. Not the assessment look, but the follow-up look, the one that came after someone had already been assessed. You're the civilian. Yes. You did all this. Dog helped. She looked at Coda. Coda looked at her. What's wrong with your shoulder? Ryan had stopped noticing that he was holding his left arm slightly away from his body, the automatic posture of a joint that didn't want to be moved. It'll keep. There's a medic with the hazmat team. I'll wait. She studied him for a second longer than strictly necessary, then turned back to her team. Get those 4 processed and separated. I want statements before anyone talks to anyone else. Ryan moved to the side of the room and sat down on a metal equipment housing that was the right height and was, more relevantly, not going anywhere. He put his back against the wall and his right hand on Coda's neck, and he breathed for a minute. Just breathed. The kind of deliberate, counted breathing he'd learned in a context that was not relevant to discuss in present company, but that worked regardless of context because the mechanics of a nervous system coming down from operational load were the same, whether the operation had been sanctioned by anyone or not. His phone buzzed. Donovan. Junction shut. Treatment facility operator confirms contaminated volume contained in secondary line. Not reached distribution. Hazmat team will flush the line. We got it. Ryan read it twice. He set the phone on his knee and looked at the ceiling for a moment, at the fluorescent lights and the concrete and the ventilation unit running its quiet hum, and he felt something move through him that wasn't relief exactly. Relief was too simple, too clean, but was in the general neighborhood of relief. The way a man feels when a thing he wasn't sure was going to work turned out to work. And the difference between that and the alternative was measured in the thousands of people who had been asleep in this valley all night while someone else tried to put poison in their water. He looked at his phone again, typed, "Good," sent it. Well, they kept him for 4 hours. This was not unreasonable. He understood the process. He'd been through versions of it before, in different uniforms, with different people asking the questions, and the architecture of an after-action debrief was something he could navigate in his sleep. What he had not navigated before was doing it as a civilian, in a county sheriff's conference room, with 2 state police investigators, a county district attorney who had driven up from 40 miles south and arrived with her coat still wet from the snow, and Detective Donovan, who sat in the corner and said almost nothing. The DA's name was Patricia Holt. She was 53, compact, with reading glasses on a chain, and the particular combination of intelligence and impatience that characterized people who spent their careers managing the gap between what the law allowed and what had actually happened. She had Ryan's statement in front of her, the written version, which he'd given to Vasquez at the pumping station and which was accurate in all material respects. She read it the way lawyers read things, which was differently from how normal people read things. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "you entered a secured facility without authorization. The gate was open. The chain had been cut by the people inside. The building itself. The maintenance access panel on the west face was not locked. The padlock was on the external maintenance housing. The panel behind it was unsecured." Holt looked at him over the glasses. "You're describing a technical entry. I'm describing what happened. The distinction matters. The admissibility of evidence collected inside that facility depends partly on how presence in the facility is characterized. I'm not a law enforcement officer," Ryan said. "I'm a civilian who entered a building through an unsecured panel to prevent what I assessed as an imminent threat to public safety. I didn't collect evidence. I stopped a valve from being fully opened, and I detained 4 individuals until law enforcement arrived." Holt looked at him for a long moment. Then she wrote something down. The state investigator, a younger man named Pratt, who had the eager energy of someone who had been waiting his whole career for a case that looked like this, leaned forward. "The device. The remote trigger. You identified it as a planted device without any technical training in—" "I identified it as something the subject had been reaching for when the dog arrived. I didn't touch it. I reported it to Detective Donovan and secured the subject." "But you recognized it as a trigger mechanism." Ryan looked at him. "It said armed on the display." A pause. Pratt wrote something down. "The planner," Holt said. "She'd been building to this. The individual in the dark jacket, you stated he provided the bypass code voluntarily. He provided it under duress, yes. Define duress." "I was holding a firearm." "His firearm," Holt said, "which you took from the guard you, and I'm quoting your statement here, controlled and disarmed." "Yes." "Mr. Mercer, I need to understand something." Holt took her glasses off and set them on the table. "You walked into a building containing 5 armed individuals. You disarmed a guard, neutralized 3 others, and had the primary subject in a position where he provided operational information, specifically a security code, within a defined time window. And you did this alone, with a dog." Ryan said nothing. "I'm not criticizing you," Holt said. "I'm trying to understand what I'm working with." Donovan, from the corner, said, "He's a former Navy SEAL, Patricia. Special operations, 4 deployments, 11 years. Holt looked at Donovan, then at Ryan. "And you're in Black Ridge Crossing because—" "I grew up here," Ryan said. "And you're doing what here?" A pause. "I hadn't decided yet." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the snow had stopped at some point in the last hour, and the afternoon light was coming through gray and watery, the kind of light that made everything look like it was seen through old glass. "The planner," Ryan said. What's his name? Holt and Pratt exchanged a look.
We're working on that. He won't have given you a real one. No, Pratt said. He hasn't given us any name. He's been cooperative in a specific way. He'll confirm facts we already have. He won't volunteer anything new.
He's waiting for someone to call a lawyer, Ryan said. Not just a lawyer, a specific lawyer, the kind that gets called for situations like this. He looked at Holt. How long before that call comes? It came 40 minutes ago, Holt said flatly. From a firm in Washington, D.C., they sent 2 partners. They're in the building now. Ryan absorbed this. Which tells you something about the organization, he said. It tells me several things about the organization, Holt said, none of which I'm going to discuss in this room right now. She put her glasses back on. What I'm going to discuss is the question of your role going forward. You're a material witness in what is shaping up to be a significant federal case. The compound produced in that facility, the distribution methodology, the corporate structure behind the holding company. This is going to be DEA, possibly FBI, possibly others. She looked at him steadily. You may be called to testify, multiple times, over an extended period. I understand. You'll need to remain available. I wasn't planning to go anywhere. Holt studied him. You said you hadn't decided what you were doing here. I've been reconsidering. Something moved across Holt's face that wasn't quite a smile but occupied the same space. She gathered her papers. Get your shoulder looked at, Mr. Mercer. She stood. And thank you. For what it's worth, and I recognize it may not be worth much coming from a county DA, what you did this morning, but the valve, the bypass, the device, if any one of those pieces had gone differently, we'd be looking at mass casualty numbers. Ryan said nothing. He looked at the table. Get your shoulder looked at, she said again, and left. Pratt followed her, pausing at the door. The dog. Does he have any certifications for the testimony package? Ryan looked at Coda. Coda looked at Pratt. He has a training record from the military working dog program. Can you get me a copy? Yes. Pratt nodded, made a note, left. Donovan was still in the corner. He hadn't moved during the whole debrief. He just sat there with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable, which Ryan had come to understand as Donovan's natural resting state rather than any particular reaction. The room was empty now, except for the 2 of them and the dog. You did good today, Donovan said. Ryan looked at him. Ava did good 8 months ago. We just finished it. Donovan was quiet for a moment. The bypass code, he said. You said he gave it too fast, that you knew it was a redirect. He paused. How? Ryan thought about how to answer that honestly. When someone's negotiating time, they give you just enough to keep you occupied without solving the problem. He gave me the code because the code solved a problem that wasn't the real problem. It was designed to feel like a win. And you recognize that. I've been in rooms with people who needed to buy time before. Donovan nodded slowly. Different context. Same mechanics. Donovan uncrossed his arms. He looked tired. The specific tired of someone who had been operating at a high level of function for longer than their body had agreed to and was now receiving the bill. What do you know about the organization? Your honest assessment. Honest assessment. Ryan turned his chair to face Donovan more directly. Left shoulder objected. He ignored it. They've been operational in this valley for the better part of a year. They have corporate legal infrastructure sophisticated enough that DC lawyers got on a plane this morning. The planner, whoever he is experienced, calm under pressure, and prepared for multiple contingencies including law enforcement intervention. The facility was equipped for industrial-scale production, not local distribution. So they weren't selling it locally. They were manufacturing it here. Remote location, low population density, local law enforcement limited in resources. The valley's access roads mean any significant law enforcement response takes time to arrive. Ryan looked at the window. This wasn't a regional operation. This was a production node for something larger, which means there are other nodes. Almost certainly. Donovan put his hands on his knees. That's a federal problem. Yes. We handed them a federal problem. We handed them most of a federal problem, Ryan said. The planner is theirs. The 4 from the station are theirs. The facility, the documentation, whatever's on those servers. He paused. What's not solved is what the organization does next. They lost a production facility. They'll build another one, somewhere else. Same methodology, different valley. Donovan looked at him. You sound like you've seen this pattern before. Ryan said nothing. Different context, Donovan said. Same mechanics, Ryan said. County General Hospital had not become less depressing in the 12 hours since Ryan had last been in it. The plastic chairs were the same plastic chairs. The coffee machine was the same coffee machine producing the same substance that bore only a theoretical relationship to coffee. The fluorescent lights had the same commitment to making everyone look vaguely unwell. Ryan sat in the chair nearest to Ava's room and waited. The medic at the pumping station had confirmed what Ryan had suspected. His left shoulder had a partially torn labrum, the kind of injury that was going to require surgery if he wanted it to work properly in the long term, and that in the short term was going to become progressively more unpleasant the more he moved it. The medic had given him a sling, which he was wearing, and ibuprofen, which he had taken, and a referral to an orthopedic surgeon in the county seat, which he had pocketed without looking at. Coda was beside him, chin on his knee. Ryan had his right hand on the dog's head. They'd been sitting like this for 20 minutes. Dr. Nanda came out of Ava's room and saw him, and stopped. The shoulder, she said. Partial labrum tear. Surgery? Probably. She looked at the sling. You came back here before going to orthopedics. I wanted to make sure she knew what happened. Nanda studied him for a moment with the particular expression doctors develop. Not unkind, not clinical exactly, but with a quality of observation that was different from ordinary looking, like they'd been trained to see things other people filtered out. She's awake. Her vitals have stabilized considerably in the last few hours. The toxin was significantly reduced by the treatment protocol overnight. Can she have visitors? 10 minutes, Nanda said. Then, what happened this morning? The water's clean, Ryan said. Nanda looked at him for 3 more seconds. Then she stepped aside. Ava was sitting up when he came in. Not all the way up. The mechanical bed was at maybe 45 degrees and she had an IV in her left arm and the monitors were still going, but sitting up in the way that people sit up when they have decided they are going to be upright, regardless of what the situation technically calls for. She looked at the sling. What did you do to your shoulder? Nothing permanent, he said. That's not an answer. Partially torn labrum. He sat down in the chair beside the bed. It'll be fine. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him that morning, in that first moment after he'd come through the door. Not the police officer look, not the patient look, but the direct, unmediated look of someone who is deciding what to say next and taking the decision seriously. The water, she said. Clean. They shut the secondary junction in time. Hazmat is flushing the line. No residential exposure. He paused. The facility is secured. 5 in custody, including the principal organizer. The device at the pumping station was rendered inert. Ava absorbed this. She was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet he could see what the last 8 months had cost her. The circles under her eyes that weren't from last night's toxin, the way she held her jaw, the particular tightness around her eyes of someone who had been carrying something alone for a long time and hadn't let themselves put it down yet. You went to the pumping station, she said. Yes. How did you know about the pumping station? Donovan told me about Arthur Pelkey and the maintenance report, and you told me to be careful of the water. I said that quietly. I heard you. She looked at her hands. I told the detectives about the truck, the blue flatbed. They thanked me and said they'd follow up. A beat. That was 6 weeks ago. I know. Miles believed me. He always believed me. But belief and resources are different things. She looked up. A 6-person department with 2 patrol cars doesn't have the bandwidth to run a parallel investigation on something that officially doesn't exist yet. No, Ryan agreed. So I kept going on my own. I know. That was stupid, she said. That was actually, professionally, a very stupid thing to do. And I knew it was stupid when I was doing it, and I did it anyway because I didn't have another option I could see. Ryan said nothing. He let that sit. Because it was true, and it deserved to be acknowledged as true rather than argued with. You didn't have to do any of this, Ava said. You were walking your dog. Coda was walking himself. I was just holding the leash. Her expression shifted. Still not quite a smile, but something that had a smile's warmth in it without the performance of one. How is he? As if he'd heard his name, which he had because he heard everything, Coda put his paws on the edge of the bed and looked at Ava with the focused attention he reserved for things he considered important. Ava put her hand out, and the dog pushed his head into it. "He was good today," Ryan said. "He was very good." Ava scratched behind the dog's ears. Coda closed his eyes briefly. "Can I ask you something?" she said, without looking up from the dog. "Yes." "You could have waited. At the pumping station. You could have stayed outside with Donovan, and the state police could have— 25 minutes, Ryan said. State police were 7 minutes out when we confirmed where the SUV was going. The drive was 8 minutes at best. That's 15 minutes of approach. Plus breach plus locate and shut the junction, all against a group who were already inside and operational. He paused. The math didn't close. She looked at him. "You've done that math before." "Yes." "In other places?" "Yes." A silence. The kind that wasn't uncomfortable, the kind that had weight and texture to it, that contained things neither of them felt obligated to say out loud. "The principal," she said. "The planner. Does he have a name yet?" "Not one he's given anyone." "But they'll get it." "Federal investigators usually do," Ryan said. "It takes time." "How much time?" "Months, maybe more." He watched her face. "That bothers you." "He planned to poison 4,000 people," Ava said. Her voice was level and quiet. "He stood in that building and told you you'd bought them a few hours, like it was a minor setback. Like people are—" She stopped herself. Her jaw was set. "It bothers me, yeah." "The organization is bigger than him," Ryan said. "When the federal case builds out, it'll reach people above him. That's how these things work." "I know how these things work." A pause. "Does it feel like enough to you?" Ryan thought about it. Not the easy answer. The one that closed the conversation cleanly. The actual answer. "No," he said. "It doesn't feel like enough. It feels like the right outcome, which is different from enough. There's no version of this where enough is possible." Ava looked at him for a moment. "You always talk like that? Like a man who spent a lot of time thinking about the difference between what's right and what's enough." "I've had a lot of time to think," he said. "Here, in Black Ridge Crossing." "And before?" She nodded slowly. The hand on Coda's head had stilled. The dog was leaning against the bed rail with his eyes half closed in a way that meant he was comfortable, which Ryan had learned was not a state Coda entered lightly. "You were going to leave," Ava said. "When you came here, you said you hadn't decided how long." "I said that." "And now?" Ryan looked at the window. The afternoon light had changed, still gray but warmer somehow, or maybe just different. The snow on the ground outside caught it and threw it back in a way that was almost bright. "I don't know," he said. And then, because it was more honest, "I haven't thought about leaving since last night." Ava was quiet for a moment. "The park," she said. "When I came around in the ambulance, I wasn't fully coherent, I know that. But I remember you." She paused. "You were very calm." "I was not very calm." "You seemed calm." "That's different. Is it something you learned or something you are?" Ryan thought about this. "I learned to seem calm because situations respond better to calm. Whether I am it underneath is a different question." She looked at him with those clear, direct eyes. "Are you?" He looked at his hand, the right one resting on his knee. It had a slight tremor in it that came and went, had come and gone for about 2 years now, the kind of thing that showed up after the adrenaline cleared and left an aftermath it hadn't fully bothered to clean up after itself. "Not always," he said. Ava looked at the tremor. She didn't comment on it. She looked back up at his face. "Thank you," she said. "For last night. For this morning. For—" She made a small gesture that encompassed more than she was going to put into words. Ryan nodded. "Ryan." It was the first time she'd used his name without it being procedural. He noticed it. She seemed to notice that he noticed it. "The town is going to find out what happened. It's a small town. It's going to find out all of it." "That's fine." "People are going to want to—" "That's fine," he said again, slightly differently. Meaning, "I've thought about that and it's fine, but let's not spend time on it." She seemed to understand. She settled back slightly against the pillow. "The park," she said. "Garrison Park." I drive past it every shift and I never... She stopped. I never thought about it as a place where something bad could happen. It's just the park. It's where I went with my mom when I was a kid. It still is, Ryan said. Nothing changed about the park. I almost died on that bench. You didn't. Close. Close isn't the same, Ryan said. I've been close. You learn that from close if you pay attention to the right parts of it. She looked at him. What do you learn? He was quiet for a moment. That the distance between what happens and what almost happens is where most of the things worth knowing live. The monitor beeped its periodic confirmation. Outside, somewhere down the corridor, someone was pushing a cart with a wheel that needed oil. The small, persistent sounds of a building full of people who were, in various degrees, in the process of getting through something. Get some rest, Ryan said. He stood. Left shoulder expressed itself loudly, and he made no outward acknowledgement of it. You too, Ava said. He started for the door. Coda fell in at his left side, which was considerate of the dog, actually, given the shoulder situation, staying on that side like a physical anchor. Ryan. He turned. Ava was looking at him with an expression he didn't have an exact word for. Something between assessment and something else. Something more personal and therefore less categorizable. The thing you said, about not thinking about leaving since last night. She held his gaze. That's not nothing. He looked at her for a moment. No, he said. It's not nothing. He went through the door. The corridor was the same corridor it had always been. The coffee machine at the end of it was still the same coffee machine. He walked past it without stopping and out through the main doors into the cold afternoon air and stood there for a moment with Coda beside him and the parking lot in front of him and the mountains visible to the north, white and enormous and indifferent in the way that mountains were. The snow on the ground caught the light and held it. His phone buzzed. Donovan. Federal task force is inbound. They want to debrief you tomorrow morning. 8 a.m., County Sheriff's Office. Don't be late. Then, after a pause, nice work today. Ryan put the phone in his pocket. He looked north, toward the mountains, toward the lake he couldn't see from here. Somewhere up there, state police and hazmat teams and federal agents were moving through a facility that had existed for 8 months in plain sight, in the middle of a valley where 4,000 people slept and worked and ate breakfast and walked their kids to school, and none of them had known. You could spend a lot of time being angry about that, or you could spend the same time understanding how it was possible. And Ryan had long since learned that the second use of the time was the one that prevented the next one. He walked to the truck, got in. Coda jumped up beside him. He sat there for a moment with his hand on the wheel and the heater not yet running because he hadn't started the engine yet. He thought about a park bench with snow on it, about a woman who had used the last 2 coherent words she had to make sure something wasn't lost, about the specific calibration of that, of knowing you might be losing consciousness and choosing those 2 words out of everything you could have said. Didn't fall. She'd been carrying the weight of it for 8 months, and she'd distilled it to 2 words in the dark, and the right person had been there to hear them. He thought about what Ava had said. That's not nothing. He started the engine. He drove south, away from the lake, into the town that had been his before it had been anything else to him, and the afternoon light did what afternoon light did in February in the mountains, which was begin its early retreat toward the dark, and the streets were quiet the way they always were after a storm, that particular held-breath quiet of a place that had weathered something and not yet fully exhaled. Ryan drove through it at the speed limit with both hands on the wheel, and the window cracked 2 inches, and Coda's nose at the gap doing whatever it was Coda's nose was always doing, cataloging and sorting and building its continuous map of the world. And the radio was off, and the town went past on both sides. And somewhere in the county system, 4 men were being processed, and a 5th was talking to lawyers who had flown in from Washington. And somewhere in a room with a green ready light and a display that said Containment Protocol Active, the long work of undoing what had almost happened was just getting started. He pulled into the gas station on Halcyon Street and got out and went inside and bought a tin of decent coffee. Actual decent coffee, not the gas station kind. There was a display near the register that he'd noticed 3 weeks ago and never acted on, and a bottle of water and a protein bar, and the girl behind the counter, who was maybe 19 and had her hair in a braid and a homework binder open beside the register, looked at the sling and said, "Oh no, are you okay?" "Fine," Ryan said. "Just a shoulder thing." "That looks like more than a shoulder thing. It's not as bad as it looks." She put his change on the counter. You're the guy who lives out on Gravel Creek Road, right? The cabin? He looked at her. Yeah. My cousin rents it to you. She studied him with the frank curiosity of 19. He said you seemed quiet. Ryan picked up his change. That's fair? Small town, she said. Not apologetically, just factually. I know, he said. I grew up here. She looked at him differently at that. Huh, she said. I didn't know that. And then, because she was 19 and had homework to get back to, well, welcome back, I guess. Ryan looked at her for a moment. Thanks, he said, and meant it in a way that was slightly larger than the word. He got back in the truck, opened the decent coffee, drove home through the quiet streets of a town that had 4,000 people in it, who had no idea how their morning might have gone differently, and he let himself be fine with that. Because that was the other thing you learned from years in situations where the gap between what happened and what almost happened was where you lived. You learned that the best outcomes were the ones nobody ever had to know about, because the ones people had to know about were the ones where something had already gone wrong. He turned onto the road toward the cabin. The mountains were behind him now, and ahead of him was the gravel road and the pines and the old cabin with its drafty walls and its bad coffee tin and its view of nothing in particular. And for the first time in a long time, longer than he'd stopped to calculate, longer than he'd let himself notice, it looked like somewhere he might actually be going instead of just somewhere he'd ended up. The cabin smelled like old wood and the decent coffee he'd made at 6 in the morning and left half finished on the counter when Donovan had called. It was still there when he got back. Cold. He drank it anyway, standing at the kitchen window, looking at the pines going dark in the early evening, and he thought about nothing in particular for about 4 minutes, which was longer than he'd managed to think about nothing in particular in a significant stretch of time. Then his shoulder informed him it was done being ignored. He sat down at the kitchen table and took the sling off carefully and moved his arm through the limited range of motion the medic had demonstrated, cataloging what was functional and what wasn't. The answer was more than he'd expected, less than he'd like. He'd torn the labrum in the same shoulder once before, 8 years ago, in a training accident that he'd described at the time as a fall, because the actual circumstances were classified and had remained classified and would probably stay that way. He knew what recovery looked like. He knew it was going to take months and that the surgery was going to happen whether he wanted it to or not, and that during those months his left arm was going to be a liability in ways that would require him to adjust. He put the sling back on. Coda jumped up onto the bed in the other room. Ryan heard the familiar sound of it, the thump, the circling, the settling. He sat at the table for a while longer. Outside, the dark came down over the mountains the way it always did in February, fast and complete, the last light going out of the sky in about 15 minutes flat. He didn't turn on many lights, just the one over the sink. He thought about the debrief tomorrow at 8, about the federal task force coming in, about the planner sitting somewhere in a county holding facility with 2 DC lawyers between him and every question anyone wanted to ask, composure presumably intact, running whatever calculation came next. He thought about Arthur Pelkey, the water treatment technician, who had flagged an anomalous pressure differential and then disappeared, whose apartment had been emptied like he'd packed. Ryan had not been able to find Pelkey in any public record that postdated his missing persons report, and the state investigators hadn't volunteered any information, and he didn't know yet whether that meant Pelkey had run fast enough or hadn't. He was going to ask Donovan tomorrow. He got up, rinsed the coffee cup, turned off the light over the sink, and went to bed. He slept for 6 hours straight, which was the longest he'd slept in approximately 4 months. The federal task force arrived on a Wednesday, 3 days after the pumping station. There were 4 of them, 2 from the DEA, 1 from the FBI's Organized Crime Division, and a 4th whose agency affiliation was described to Ryan as interagency coordination, which was the kind of description that meant something specific to people who knew how to read it. Ryan knew how to read it. He didn't ask follow-up questions. The debrief happened at the county sheriff's office, in a conference room that was slightly larger than the one at the PD but had the same quality of furniture, which was to say, functional, joyless, and bolted in place. Ryan sat across from the 4 of them with Donovan beside him, and he gave his account of everything from the park bench to the pumping station in the organized, sequential way he'd been giving accounts of operational events for 11 years, not reading from notes, not summarizing, just moving through it in the order it had happened. including the parts that reflected badly on his decision-making, because accurate accounts included those parts, and the people across the table would eventually find them anyway. The DEA agent, a man named Calloway, lean, with the permanent slight sunburn of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors, asked the most questions. He was focused on the facility, on the specific equipment Ryan had observed in the 2-second window before the personnel door had closed, on the yellow hazard labels and the drum dimensions. "You said industrial scale," Calloway said. "Specifically." The drums were 250-liter capacity, minimum, standard hazmat yellow with GHS pictograms, from the distance and the 2-second window. "I can't give you exact count, but the floor space visible suggested at least 8 drums, possibly more arranged behind the 2 I could see. That's a significant volume." "Yes. For a compound of this class, that kind of volume suggests they weren't planning one incident," Ryan said, "and it suggests Black Ridge Crossing wasn't the primary target. It was a proof of concept." Calloway looked at him. "What makes you say that?" "The location, the corporate structure, the timeline, 8 months of operation without attracting significant law enforcement attention. You build that kind of infrastructure and you test it in a location where the failure cost is low relative to the intelligence gain. If it works, if the water system can be successfully contaminated and the attribution delayed long enough, you have a replicable methodology." The room was quiet. The fourth agent, the interagency one, was writing something. "Mr. Mercer," he said without looking up, "your assessment of the principal subject, the planner, have you formed a view on whether he's operational leadership or a contractor?" Ryan looked at him. "Contractor. High-end, specialized. He had the profile of someone who plans and executes on commission, not someone who runs the organization. He was protective of the operational details, but not the principle. He didn't talk about the organization the way someone talks about their organization. He talked about it the way a professional talks about a client." The fourth agent looked up from his notes. "That's a precise distinction." "It's a relevant one," Ryan said. "It means whoever commissioned this is still operational and has the resources to commission it again." The fourth agent held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at his notes. "What was your role exactly in naval special warfare?" "That's not relevant to these proceedings," Ryan said. "I disagree." "You can disagree," Ryan said. "My service record is available through the appropriate channels. What's relevant here is what I observed on the morning in question and what I did. Those are in my statement." Donovan, beside him, said nothing, but Ryan could feel the quality of his silence, which was the silence of someone who had made a deliberate decision to stay out of a specific exchange. The fourth agent looked at Ryan for another moment. Then he smiled. Brief, professional, the kind of smile that acknowledged a position without agreeing with it. "Fair enough," he said. The debrief ran for 3 hours. At the end of it, Calloway shook Ryan's hand and said, in a tone that carried more weight than the words themselves, "You did something significant here. The compound profile matches a threat we've been tracking across 3 states for 14 months. What you preserved at that pumping station is the first intact evidence set we've had. It changes the shape of the case considerably." Ryan shook his hand. "We'll be in touch," Calloway said. "I know," Ryan said. The planner's name turned out to be Edmund Voss. Donovan told him on a Friday, 2 weeks after the pumping station, over coffee at the diner on Main Street that had been open since 1962 and showed no signs of reconsidering. The coffee there was better than anything Ryan had managed to produce in the cabin. He was on his 2nd cup. "Edmund Voss," Donovan said, "Belgian national, 57. Former consultant to several European chemical conglomerates, and according to the DEA's file, suspected involvement in at least 4 incidents across 3 continents over the past decade. Nothing proven, no convictions. He'd been very careful. Until here." "Until here." Donovan turned his own cup in his hands. "The lawyers tried. They had a genuinely creative theory of the evidence. But the bypass code, the fact that he provided it, on record, with the state police recording the radio traffic from Vasquez's unit inside the building, that's a problem for a creative legal theory. It establishes intent and knowledge." He paused. "He's going to trial." Ryan looked out the diner window. Main Street was quiet in the way it was always quiet in February. A few cars, a woman walking a dog that was not a German shepherd, a
A kid on a bike navigating the cleared sidewalk with the focused intensity of someone who had recently learned that bikes and ice were not compatible. Arthur Pelkey, Ryan said. Donovan put his cup down. Alive.
He's in federal protective custody. He'd been in contact with the DEA for 2 months before the incident. That's how the fourth agent's office had any background on the threat profile. Pelkey reached out, they set up a channel, but the timeline accelerated faster than the federal response could. He looked at Ryan. He's going to testify. Ryan nodded. He's scared, Donovan said, but he's going to do it. Good. They sat with that for a moment. You could have died, Donovan said. Not accusatory, just stating a thing that was true and that both of them had been in proximity to for 2 weeks and hadn't directly said. Yes, Ryan said. At the pumping station, when you went in alone. Yes. Does that... Donovan paused, choosing the word. Does that register for you? The way it would for someone who hasn't... It registers differently, Ryan said. Not less. Differently. He looked at his coffee. When you've been in situations where that was the actual outcome for people you were with, when you've seen what the other side of it looks like, the calculation changes. Not because you don't value it, because you understand what you're weighing it against. Donovan was quiet. The 4,000 people in this valley, Ryan said, in the hospital, in the school, people who had no idea. He turned the cup once. It registers. Donovan picked up his coffee. You're a strange man to have walked into town when you did. I grew up here. A lot of people grow up here. They don't all come back and stop a chemical attack in their first 6 weeks. Ryan looked at him. Most people don't get the specific circumstances. No, Donovan said. They don't. He set the cup down. Town council is meeting next week. They want to do something. Recognition, ceremony, whatever the right word is. He looked uncomfortable, which was its own kind of recognition of something. You should know that's coming. I'll survive it. You're not. Donovan paused. A lot of people in your position would want it. The attention, the acknowledgement. Ryan said nothing. You don't want it, Donovan said. But you're not going to leave before it happens, which suggests that something's changed from the man who rented a cabin at the end of a gravel road specifically because it had no neighbors. Ryan looked out the window again. The kid on the bike had made it to the end of the block without incident. Something's changed, he agreed. Ava came home on a Thursday, 16 days after the bench. She drove herself from the hospital, which Dr. Nanda had argued against and which Ava had done anyway, because there were aspects of her recovery that Ava had decided were going to happen on her terms, and this was one of them. Ryan knew this because Donovan told him, and he knew Donovan told him because Donovan had a quality of deliberate information management, choosing what to share and when, that Ryan had come to recognize as one of the man's primary relational tools. He didn't go to see her that day. She'd been through something that required its own processing, and arriving at someone's house on the day they came home from the hospital with the specific pretext of checking in was the kind of thing that looked like care and functioned as an imposition. He waited 4 days. On a Monday afternoon, he drove into town, parked on Birch Avenue, and walked through the part of Garrison Park that took him past the bench. He stopped there. The park was empty. The snow was still heavy on the ground, but it had softened in the past week, the edges rounding, the surface developing the particular glaze of snow that has been through a partial thaw and refrozen. The bench was just a bench, an ordinary green-painted metal bench with a slat missing from the back, which he noticed now that he looked at it as an object and not as the place where a woman had nearly died. He stood there for a moment. Then he sat down on it. It was cold. It was an uncomfortable bench. The air smelled like snow and pine, and very faintly like the coffee from the shop on the next block that was apparently doing good business on a Monday, because people in mountain towns in February needed coffee in a way that had the quality of a requirement rather than a preference. Coda sat beside him and looked at the path. Ryan sat there for about 5 minutes. He wasn't sure exactly what he was doing. He was not a man who spent a lot of time on symbolic gestures, and he was aware that sitting on a bench in a park did not accomplish anything concrete, and he did it anyway, because sometimes the place where something happened needed to be occupied differently than it had been the last time, and this seemed like a reasonable opportunity to accomplish that. He got up, walked north through the park, came out the north entrance onto the street. Ava was walking toward him from the direction of her building, 2 blocks down. She was in civilian clothes, dark jacket, scarf, moving at about 80% of what her natural pace probably was, which he could estimate from how she held herself, the slight careful quality of someone whose body was still cataloging its own reliability. She had a paper cup of coffee from the same shop he'd been smelling. She saw him and stopped. Then she kept walking. They met at the corner. "You were in the park," she said, walking the dog. She looked at Coda. Coda looked at her. His tail moved. "You sat on the bench," she said. "I saw you from the window." Ryan looked at her. "How are you doing?" "Better than 2 weeks ago." She looked past him at the park entrance. "I've been thinking about going in there. I've walked past the entrance 4 times since I got home, and I haven't gone in." "You'll go when you go." "That's not very helpful." "It's accurate, though." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. She looked at him. That direct, unmediated look she had, the one that didn't perform anything. "You look like your shoulder still hurts," she said. "It does." "Surgery?" "Scheduled for 3 weeks from Tuesday." "Will you be—" She paused, reconsidered the phrasing. "Recovery timeline?" 4 to 6 months to full function, which is apparently the medical community's way of saying they don't know. She nodded. They stood on the corner in the cold, and neither of them moved toward anything in particular. And it wasn't an awkward silence. It was a silence that had been earned by the specific events of the past 16 days and had the right to exist as a silence rather than being filled with something easier. "I went back to the bench," she said finally. He waited. "Yesterday. I went in early, before anyone else was in the park. I just walked to it and sat down for a while." She looked at her coffee cup. "It was just a bench." "Yes," he said. "That's going to sound like it was nothing." "It sounds like it was something," he said. "A specific and necessary something that looks like nothing from outside." She looked at him. "You've done that before. Returned to a place." "Different places," he said. "Same impulse." "Does it help?" He thought about it. "It doesn't fix anything, but it makes the thing real in the right way instead of the wrong way. The wrong way is when it stays in your head as something larger than it was. Going back makes it the actual size." Ava was quiet for a moment. "I keep thinking about the people who didn't know. 4,000 people who went to sleep that night and had no idea." "I know. Does that go away?" "No," Ryan said. "You just stop expecting it to." She looked at him. "That's a different kind of answer than I was hoping for." "I know," he said again. She smiled. Actual smile this time, complete, the kind that reached her eyes and acknowledged something real. "You're honest in an annoying way. Comes with the configuration. Is that what we're calling it?" "That's what I'm calling it." She looked at the park entrance. Something in her posture shifted. Not dramatic, just a small reorientation, the weight moving forward slightly. "Walk with me," she said. Ryan looked at the park. "Sure," he said. They went in. The town council meeting happened on a Thursday evening in the community center, which was a building that had been many things over its 50-year history and currently served as meeting room, polling place, and on Saturday mornings, the location of a farmer's market that persisted through winter on the strength of 2 vendors who sold root vegetables and 1 woman who made jam. Ryan went because Donovan asked him to, and because declining felt like it would cost more than attending. He sat in the back with Coda under the chair and his arm in the sling and his jacket on, because the community center's heating system was optimistic about what it could accomplish. There were maybe 200 people there, which was a significant fraction of Blackridge Crossing, and they sat in folding chairs and stood along the walls, and had the collective energy of people who had discovered, some days after the fact, that something terrible had nearly happened to them while they were going about ordinary life, and who were still working out how to hold that. The council chair, a woman in her 60s named Margaret Osei, who had been running these meetings for 12 years with the organized competence of someone who genuinely believed in the process, led them through it. The facts, as could be disclosed without compromising the ongoing federal investigation. The water system's current status, confirmed clean and restored to full operation. The 5 individuals in custody. The coordinated response of county and state law enforcement. And then she talked about the people who had been involved before it became a coordinated response. She talked about Ava, who was sitting 3 rows from the front and who Ryan could see from the back was holding herself with the careful stillness of someone who had decided they were going to get through this without their face doing anything they hadn't sanctioned. She talked about Donovan, who was beside Ava, and who looked at the floor in the manner of a man who had made peace with being mentioned in public, but had not made peace with enjoying it. And she talked about Ryan. She said his name, and the room turned, the way rooms turn, 200 people looking toward the back. Ryan looked at the wall just slightly above their eye line and waited for it to be done. Margaret Osei had the good sense to be specific rather than grand. She did not use words like heroic, which Ryan would have found difficult to sit through with a straight face. She said, "He was walking through the park at night, and he saw someone who needed help, and he helped, and he kept helping through a night and a morning that required more than most people will ever be asked to give." She said it plainly, in the manner of someone reciting a fact, and it landed the way plain facts land, which was more effectively than an elaboration would have. And then she said, "We'd like to do something for the dog." There was a sound in the room, collective, warm, the specific affectionate sound that 200 people make when a dog is mentioned in a context where a dog has done something worth mentioning. Coda, under Ryan's chair, looked up at the noise with his ears forward. Someone had made a thing, a small plaque, engraved, mounted on a piece of dark wood. Margaret Osei brought it to Ryan, and he took it with his good arm and looked at it, and then looked at Coda. The engraving said, "Coda, Black Ridge Crossing, February, in service to the community." It was the right kind of recognition. Simple, accurate, without inflation. "We also want to offer you something," Margaret Osei said to Ryan specifically now, the meeting having shifted into something less formal, the 200 people watching without the agenda's structure. "The town is not a rich town, but we have resources, and we have gratitude that we'd like to make concrete, if there's something you need." Ryan looked at her. He thought about the cabin with its drafty walls and its gravel road, about the surgery in 3 weeks, about the federal debrief that had suggested, in the way federal debriefs suggested things, that his particular profile and his particular understanding of a particular kind of operation might be of ongoing interest to the people who managed such interests. He thought about standing in the park with Ava an hour before this meeting, walking the paths in the late afternoon, both of them quiet mostly. Coda covering 3 times the ground they covered because that was Coda's preferred pace, and the light coming through the birches at the angle that only happened in February, and only for about 20 minutes before it dropped below the mountain line. He thought about the bench, which was just a bench. "I'm all right," he said. "I appreciate it." Margaret Osei looked at him for a moment. "You're planning to stay." It wasn't a question exactly. It was the kind of statement a person makes when they've been reading a situation for a few days and they've arrived at a conclusion and they want to confirm it. Ryan looked at the room. At 200 people who had lived in this valley their whole lives or chosen to come here and had found the particular thing that made them stay. At Donovan in the 3rd row, who had his arms crossed and was looking at Ryan with an expression that was the closest thing to warmth Ryan had seen on his face in 2 weeks of interaction. At Ava, who had turned in her seat and was looking at him with those clear eyes and an expression that said nothing specific and communicated everything relevant. "I think so," he said. Margaret Osei nodded once, like something had been confirmed. The room responded in the way rooms responded to things that were right. Not loudly, not with a production of it, just with a quality of settling. Like 200 people had been holding a breath they hadn't known they were holding and had collectively decided to let it out. March came slowly, the way it always did in the mountains, winter yielding ground in small daily increments that were only visible when you compared the light at 7 in the morning to what it had been a week earlier. Ryan had the surgery on a Tuesday. He came back to the cabin from the county hospital with his arm in a proper post-surgical immobilizer and a prescription for anti-inflammatories and instructions he mostly followed. And Coda spent the next 3 days extremely close to him in the manner of a dog who had identified a situation that required close monitoring and was applying himself accordingly. Donovan called twice a week. Not about the case. The case had migrated almost entirely to the federal level, and what remained in the county was the administrative aftermath of an investigation that was going to take years to fully resolve. He called because that was what Donovan did with people he'd decided to keep track of. He asked how the shoulder was. He mentioned things happening in town. He passed along, with the specific casualness of a man conveying information he'd been asked to convey, things that Ava had said. The planner, Vas, was indicted on 17 counts by a federal grand jury in the second week of March. The indictment included conspiracy to commit mass harm, production and distribution of a controlled chemical compound, and 3 counts relating to the attempted murder of a law enforcement officer. The D.C. lawyers issued a statement that contained the word baseless 4 times and the phrase prosecutorial overreach twice. The statement did not appear to concern the federal prosecutors significantly. The 4 men from the pumping station took plea agreements. Their cooperation provided, according to a call Calloway made to Ryan on a Wednesday morning, significant additional architecture on the organization's broader network. 2 other production facilities were identified and shut down before the end of March. One in a rural area 3 states west, one in a converted agricultural building in the Northeast that had been operational for 6 months. Proof of concept, Ryan had said. He'd been right about that part. What he hadn't said in the debrief, because it wasn't his place to say it, and because the federal investigators were more than capable of arriving at it themselves, was that the methodology Vyas had developed, the corporate layering, the remote location production model, the targeting of municipal water infrastructure in low-density areas, was going to be attempted again by someone else regardless of how completely this particular network was dismantled. The value of the methodology didn't disappear with its creators. He'd said it to Donovan instead, on one of the Wednesday calls. Donovan had been quiet for a moment and then said, "Is that something you want to do something about?" Ryan had thought about that for a few days. He called Calloway on a Thursday, told him he had some thoughts on the methodology and the counter-methodology, if the task force had interest in a consulting conversation. Calloway said he'd been expecting that call for about a week and had already discussed it with his supervisor. It was not a job. It was not a return to anything resembling what he'd been doing before. It was something that didn't have an obvious category, which he found, unexpectedly, to be part of its appeal. He could be in Black Ridge Crossing. He could have the cabin, and the gravel road, and the dog, and the coffee from the shop on the block next to Garrison Park that he'd started stopping at in the mornings when he walked Coda through the neighborhood streets. He could have the slow work of a shoulder healing on a schedule that didn't care about urgency. And when there was something that his specific understanding of a specific kind of problem could contribute to, he could contribute to it. It was not a perfect arrangement, it was a real one. On a Saturday in late March, with the snow down to about 4 inches on the ground, and the birches in Garrison Park. Starting their preliminary discussions with the coming spring, Ryan walked to the park at 8 in the morning with Coda and a coffee. He'd made at the cabin that was better than the gas station kind, but not as good as the shop kind, which was the accurate position the cabin coffee occupied in the hierarchy. Ava was already there. She was sitting on the bench, not the posture of someone working through something, just sitting. Elbows on knees, coffee cup in both hands, looking at the frozen pond that was in the early stages of becoming a non-frozen pond. She had color in her face that hadn't been there a month ago, and she was in her uniform because she'd gone back to duty 2 weeks earlier, half shifts at first and then full, because that was Ava's relationship with recovery. She treated it like a case to be closed. She didn't turn when Ryan and Coda came up the path. She'd heard them. "You're early," she said. "You're earlier." He sat down on the bench beside her, leaving a reasonable amount of space, which was not an enormous amount of space given the bench's dimensions. Coda sat in front of the bench and looked at the pond. "I come here in the morning sometimes," Ava said. "Before shift. I decided the bench needed to be a bench again." "Is it?" She looked at it. The green paint, the missing slat. "Working on it." They sat for a while. The park was empty except for them and a crow that was conducting some business in the birch tree to the left, with the focused energy of a bird with a specific agenda. "I heard you talk to Calloway," Ava said. "Donovan." "He didn't tell me. I have my own sources." She glanced at him sideways. "Are you going to be doing that? The consulting thing? When there's something relevant? Yes." "From here." "From here." She nodded slowly, looked at the pond. "I thought about leaving," she said. "After. When I was in the hospital, I thought, maybe this is what this place was, and maybe it's done being what it was, and maybe it's time." She paused. "I've lived here my whole life. It's not like there's nowhere else." Ryan said nothing. He let her have the space. "But then I thought about what the town would look like without the people who know what it almost lost." She turned her coffee cup once in her hands. Someone has to know. Someone has to remember it the right way. Yes, Ryan said. Is that why you're staying? One of the reasons? He thought about it. One of them, he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light was doing the February to March thing it did, that incremental warming of the angle that wasn't yet spring but was no longer fully winter. We should probably stop meeting at crisis events, Ava said. We could meet somewhere else. We are somewhere else. This is a park bench. It was a crisis event location. It's becoming a bench again, she said. You said so. Ryan looked at the pond. I said you said it was working on it. Same thing. He looked at her. She was looking at the pond, but there was a quality of awareness in how she was holding herself, a slight tension in the corner of her jaw that was not distress, was almost the opposite of distress, actually. Coffee, he said. There's that place on the corner. I've been going there in the mornings. I know the place. After you're done sitting on the bench. She was quiet for a moment. The crow in the birch tree made a sound that was not subtle. After I'm done sitting on the bench, she said. They sat there a while longer. Coda watched the pond with the patience of a dog who has learned that patience is not the absence of wanting things, but the management of the timing around wanting them. The light moved. The crow finished its business and left. Somewhere on the other side of the park, a car started up and drove somewhere, and the sound of it faded into the usual quiet. Eventually, Ava stood up. She looked at the bench for a moment, the specific look of someone completing a process they'd set themselves to complete. Then she looked at Ryan. You still owe me the full version of the pumping station, she said. You gave Donovan the operational summary. I want the actual version. Over coffee, Ryan said. Over coffee, she agreed. He stood. His shoulder was not happy about the cold, which was information he incorporated and set aside. Coda was already moving toward the park exit, the dog's internal navigation having identified the probable destination and approved of it. They walked out of Garrison Park together into the March morning, and the town went on around them in the ordinary way that towns go on when the worst thing that might have happened didn't happen. Unhurried, unaware, occupied with its own life. And the bench behind them was just a bench. And the water that came out of the taps in 4,000 homes in the valley was clean, and the mountains held the sky the way they always had, enormous and patient and indifferent to whether any of it meant anything. It meant something. Not to the mountains, to the people who had chosen, each for their own reasons, to be in this valley when it needed someone to choose to be there. That is how most things that matter actually get done. Not by the loudest people in the room, not by the ones who anticipated recognition, but by the ones who simply refused to walk away when walking away was the easier option, and who carried what they carried quietly enough that they had something left when it counted.